It was a crisp, overcast morning in Washington, D.C., and the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. On the marble steps outside the courthouse, reporters bustled, microphones poised for the next big scoop. Inside, the atmosphere was just as charged, yet a bit more restrained. People shuffled quietly in their seats, some flipping through legal papers, others muttering to each other about the day's case. But all of that would change in a moment. Dwayne Johnson, better known as The Rock to millions of fans around the world, walked through the door. His imposing figure, dressed in a tailored dark suit, immediately caught the attention of everyone in the room. The camera flashes snapped as he passed, but they weren't for the right reasons. Dwayne wasn't in this courtroom as a celebrity, though the aura of fame still clung to him like a second skin. Today, he was here as a witness in a high-profile case involving national security. But the moment his presence was announced, the room buzzed with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Who would have thought that the famous wrestler-turned-actor would be sitting in this very courtroom? The judge, a stern, seasoned man named Judge Avery, was no different. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file in front of him, muttering under his breath. Then, as if trying to break the tension, Judge Avery glanced up and gave a small, mocking chuckle. "Well, this is certainly a surprise," Judge Avery said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I didn't realize Hollywood had started sending their stars to testify in legal matters." The laughter in the courtroom was barely contained. Some of the lawyers smirked, others stifled chuckles, while the few who recognized the weight of the situation remained silent. Dwayne stood tall, his hands firmly clasped in front of him. His jaw tightened, but he remained calm. This wasn't the first time he had been treated like a novelty in a serious setting. In fact, it was one of the reasons he had stayed out of the public eye for a while. But today, he had a job to do, and that job involved making sure the truth was told, no matter how absurd the situation might feel. Judge Avery continued, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of his words. "I must admit, Mr. Johnson, I'm curious to know what a man of your stature could possibly have to say about national security." He leaned back in his chair and raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps a new action movie coming out soon?" A few snickers echoed through the room. Dwayne's expression didn't change, but beneath the cool exterior, a flicker of anger burned. This was not what he had expected when he was summoned here. "Your Honor," Dwayne began, his voice steady, but carrying a weight of authority. "I'm here as a representative of the United States Secret Service. I've been serving for years, and I'm here to provide critical testimony regarding the case at hand. If you'll allow me to, I'd like to proceed." The judge raised an eyebrow, the smirk still playing on his lips. "Ah, yes. The Secret Service," he said with exaggerated mockery. "And here I thought you were just a man in a suit with a bodyguard gig. Very well, proceed." The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. Everyone was waiting for what would happen next. Dwayne's eyes didn't waver from the judge as he took his seat at the witness stand. His hand slid into his jacket pocket, where the leather-bound badge of the United States Secret Service rested. But he didn't flash it yet. No, not yet. He needed to make them understand the seriousness of this moment. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. The case he was testifying in involved a high-stakes international conspiracy, one that, if left unchecked, could bring harm to the United States. Dwayne knew the gravity of the situation. The fate of countless lives hung in the balance. Judge Avery, meanwhile, still seemed unconvinced, his eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and skepticism. Dwayne could feel the weight of his gaze, but he didn't flinch. "You know, Mr. Johnson," the judge continued, his tone now tinged with a sense of superiority, "I would have expected someone a bit more, I don't know, seasoned. When it comes to matters of national security." Dwayne's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, a low murmur rippled through the courtroom. It wasn't about what the judge had said. It was the fact that everyone in the room was beginning to realize Dwayne Johnson, the wrestler-turned-actor, was far more than he appeared to be. With one calm motion, Dwayne reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the leather badge that identified him as a fully fledged agent of the United States Secret Service. The room went still. The laughter from moments ago was replaced by silence, a thick, almost tangible silence that hung heavy in the air. Dwayne slowly turned the badge so it caught the light, his expression remaining unchanged. The effect was immediate. The chuckles that had echoed moments before died out, and even the reporters, who had been eagerly taking notes, stopped writing. Judge Avery's expression faltered. His mouth went dry. The small smirk he'd carried for most of the hearing now disappeared completely. He froze. There it was, the official seal of the United States Secret Service. The real deal. Dwayne wasn't just some actor. He wasn't just a bodybuilder turned media sensation. He was a trained, highly skilled agent, tasked with the protection of the nation's most powerful leaders. The judge cleared his throat, looking down at his desk, his face flushed with embarrassment. I see, he muttered, his voice now much smaller than before. Dwayne didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slid the badge back into his pocket and adjusted his posture, leaning slightly forward as he addressed the room. I understand that this might be difficult to accept, Judge, Dwayne said, his voice steady. But my job today is to ensure that the truth comes out, and I will do whatever it takes to see that justice is served. The judge finally composed himself, but his tone was noticeably different. I apologize, Mr. Johnson. You may proceed with your testimony. The courtroom had shifted. It wasn't just the judge who had changed. It was everyone in the room. The atmosphere had gone from mockery to reverence in a matter of seconds, and as Dwayne began his testimony, the weight of his words was felt by all. What had started as a moment of ridicule now felt like the opening chapter of a much larger story, a story in which Dwayne Johnson wasn't just the subject of laughs, but the man who would lead the charge in a battle no one could have predicted. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson sat at the witness stand, his mind racing, but his face remained as calm and composed as it ever was. The courtroom around him had gone eerily quiet, and every eye was on him, whether it was with respect, confusion, or renewed curiosity. The judge had apologized, but that didn't change the fact that this moment, in some ways, was bigger than all of them. It wasn't about celebrity. It wasn't about his career as an actor or wrestler. It was about his real purpose in the world, the one that few people knew about and even fewer respected. As he sat there, his gaze shifted, reflecting on the path that had brought him here. This unassuming man in a suit, sitting at the heart of a legal battlefield. To many, Dwayne Johnson was a familiar face from movies, wrestling rings, and the glossy covers of magazines. But to a select few, he was something far more than that. A man whose life had been shaped by adversity, ambition, and an unshakable commitment to service. His journey had begun long before the cameras and bright lights of Hollywood. It had started in the ring. Born into a family of wrestlers, Dwayne had a reputation to uphold. His father, Rocky Johnson, was a respected wrestler himself, and his grandfather, Peter Maivia, was a legendary figure in the world of professional wrestling. From a young age, Dwayne was thrust into the world of competition. Wrestling wasn't just a sport to him. It was a way of life, a tradition passed down through generations. The pressure to succeed was immense, and the expectations weighed heavily on his shoulders. Yet, despite the odds, he rose to the occasion. He earned his first WWE contract at the age of 24, and his path in professional wrestling quickly took off. The Rock became a household name, known for his electrifying charisma, his fierce athleticism, and his unmatched confidence. He quickly became one of the most beloved and successful wrestlers of all time. But fame came with its own set of challenges. Dwayne was no stranger to setbacks. He'd encountered plenty of struggles, both professional and personal, along the way. Injuries that threatened to end his career, a string of failed relationships, and the crushing reality of constantly being in the public eye had taken their toll. But what separated him from many was his resilience. He always found a way to get back up. It wasn't always easy, but through it all, Dwayne had learned to push through the pain, to move forward with a sense of purpose. After wrestling, Dwayne entered the world of acting. His transition from the ring to the silver screen wasn't a smooth one, as many people doubted his ability to succeed as a Hollywood actor. But once again, Dwayne proved them wrong. His natural charisma, combined with his dedication to mastering new skills, allowed him to become one of the most sought-after actors in the world. From action-packed blockbusters to family comedies, Dwayne conquered Hollywood the same way he had conquered the wrestling ring. But what most people didn't know was that Dwayne's transition from celebrity to Secret Service agent was one of the most unexpected turns of his life. It all started when he received an offer that would change his life forever. A phone call one evening from a government official led him down a path he had never imagined. The offer was simple yet monumental: become an agent of the United States Secret Service. His years of discipline, understanding of security protocols, and his status as a public figure made him an ideal candidate. The agency needed someone who could blend seamlessly into high-profile situations, someone with the charisma to handle delicate security matters without drawing attention, and someone who understood the importance of protecting those who needed it most. Dwayne had always been a man driven by a sense of duty. Whether it was to his family, his fans, or his country, he had always believed in the importance of service. The idea of stepping into this new role wasn't one he took lightly. The rigorous training, the late nights, the constant need to stay ahead of the game. It was a grueling process. But Dwayne threw himself into the work with the same determination that had led him to become a champion wrestler and a Hollywood star. In many ways, this was his calling, one that required him to lay down his ego and embrace a quieter, more covert way of life. But becoming an agent of the Secret Service wasn't about the fame or the glory. It was about protecting the people who mattered most, leaders of the nation, and the public at large. It was about making sure the wheels of democracy turned smoothly, even when the world around them threatened to spin out of control. And Dwayne took this responsibility seriously. He trained alongside the best of the best, learning the ins and outs of covert operations, intelligence gathering, and national security measures. There was nothing glamorous about it. No red carpets, no cameras, no public admiration. It was real work, behind the scenes, in service of something greater than himself. And so, here he was today, sitting in this courtroom, ready to testify about a case involving international threats to national security. His role as a Secret Service agent had brought him here, but no one in this room knew the full extent of what that truly meant. They didn't know about the covert operations he had led, the dangers he had faced, or the lives he had saved. They didn't know about the hours he'd spent studying threat reports, working with federal agencies, and ensuring that the very people who criticized him today were safe from harm. Dwayne had never been one to boast about his work, but as he sat there in the witness stand, he realized something. This was the part of the job that required him to step into the light. It wasn't about the fame or the accolades. It was about the truth. The same truth that had brought him here today. He thought back to the moment in the courtroom just moments ago, when the judge had mocked him. The words still stung, but they also reminded him of the path he had walked. The path from being a misunderstood athlete to a celebrated actor, and now, a Secret Service agent. Through all the misunderstandings and judgments, Dwayne had found a way to stay true to himself. The journey hadn't been easy. Far from it. But it had shaped him into someone capable of navigating even the most daunting of challenges. Now, as the courtroom shifted its attention to him, Dwayne knew that he had a responsibility, one that extended far beyond his own reputation. He was here to protect more than just the people in this room. He was here to ensure that the truth came out, no matter the cost. The story of his life, full of twists and turns, had led him here. And whatever came next, Dwayne was ready to face it head-on. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Dwayne took his place on the witness stand. The judge, still visibly flustered from his earlier mistake, cleared his throat and tried to regain control of the proceedings. The reporters, their curiosity piqued, scribbled notes feverishly, while the lawyers exchanged glances, unsure of how to proceed now that the atmosphere had shifted so dramatically. It was no longer a typical case. The celebrity sitting before them was no longer just a star. He was an agent of the U.S. Secret Service. Dwayne adjusted his posture, settling into the role he had grown accustomed to, calm, controlled, and unwavering. His eyes scanned the room, noting the change in energy. It was subtle, but the air had thickened, weighed down by uncertainty. Some of the lawyers now saw him with a mix of caution and respect, while others, still skeptical, appeared uneasy. No one dared to speak out of turn. The room was quiet as a new layer of seriousness had enveloped the courtroom. The prosecutor, a sharp and well-dressed woman named Claire Donovan, was the first to recover from the shock. She gathered herself and stood, her heels clicking sharply on the floor as she approached the stand. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her tone steady but laced with an edge of suspicion, "can you please confirm your involvement in the national security operation that this case concerns?" Dwayne met her gaze, unflinching. "I am one of the lead agents involved in this operation, Ms. Donovan. I've been working with several federal agencies, including the FBI and the CIA, to assess and counteract a serious international security threat. Would you care to elaborate?" Claire pressed, leaning forward slightly. There was an underlying challenge in her voice, though it wasn't overt. The implications of Dwayne's role in such a high-stakes case made her uneasy. She had heard of Dwayne Johnson, of course, but no one had expected his name to be associated with something so covert, so serious. Dwayne nodded. He was used to difficult questions, but this one felt different. "I can't provide details of the operation, as it's classified. What I can tell you is that we have intercepted credible threats involving foreign operatives planning to infiltrate the highest levels of government." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. The entire courtroom went still. Everyone knew what this meant. International espionage, the potential for catastrophic breaches in security, and the possibility that the lives of high-ranking government officials could be in danger. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed, but she didn't push further. Instead, she shifted the focus. "And can you confirm, Mr. Johnson, that your involvement in this case was purely as a witness, or did you have a more direct role?" Dwayne hesitated, just for a moment. He could feel the room watching him, feeling the weight of their curiosity, their skepticism. This wasn't just about his testimony. This was about how they perceived him now, how his true role as an agent would unfold before their eyes. He wasn't a celebrity anymore. He wasn't even just a Secret Service agent. He was something more, something the room wasn't ready for. "I am here to provide testimony on behalf of the operation." "Yes," Dwayne answered, his voice steady, giving nothing away. "But my role has been active from the beginning. I've personally been involved in securing high-profile locations, conducting threat assessments, and gathering intelligence." A low murmur rippled through the room as the full extent of Dwayne's involvement began to settle in. The courtroom was slowly realizing that they weren't just dealing with a man who played a tough guy on screen. They were dealing with a man who lived the role of a protector, someone who operated at the highest levels of government security. The prosecutor took a step back, sensing that her line of questioning was going nowhere. Her eyes darted to the defense, a well-groomed man in his mid-40s named Nathan Carter, who hadn't spoken much up until this point. Nathan adjusted his tie, standing up to approach the witness stand with an almost deliberate calmness. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his voice smooth and calculated, "I must admit, you have quite an interesting resume. But let's cut to the chase. Your presence here is related to a rather specific incident, isn't it? A breach involving the highest levels of government security. Can you confirm that?" Dwayne didn't flinch. He had been waiting for this. This was the moment the defense would try to undermine his credibility, to shift the narrative into questioning his true role in the events. "Yes, that's correct. It involves several key figures within our government, including individuals who had their security compromised." Nathan smiled slightly, sensing an opening. "And, Mr. Johnson, do you believe you have the necessary qualifications to speak on such a sensitive matter? Your previous career in entertainment hardly prepares you for these kinds of situations, does it?" The insinuation was clear. Nathan was trying to play to the jury's potential doubts about Dwayne's qualifications. He was trying to imply that Dwayne's fame could cloud his judgment or his ability to contribute meaningfully to such an important case. The prosecutor seemed to agree, her eyes darting from Dwayne to Nathan, as though she were trying to gauge his response. But Dwayne, ever the professional, wasn't rattled. He knew this game. He'd been through far worse in his career. With a slow, deliberate breath, he met Nathan's gaze head-on. "My qualifications, Mr. Carter, aren't defined by the movies I've starred in or the wrestling titles I've won," Dwayne said, his voice low but powerful. They are defined by the real work I've done in the field, by my training, my experience, and my ability to protect this country's most vulnerable assets. The life of every person in this room and every citizen across this nation could depend on what we're doing here today. There was a pause, a long one. The room fell silent again as everyone processed Dwayne's words. It wasn't just the content of his answer that hit hard, it was the delivery. His words weren't meant to prove his worth to anyone. They were a statement of fact. The truth was undeniable. The judge, who had been unusually quiet since the earlier commotion, cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, I suggest we focus on the matter at hand and allow Mr. Johnson to finish his testimony without further interruptions." Nathan's smile faded, but he returned to his seat without another word. The tension in the room had reached a new level. The battle lines were drawn. It was no longer just about a case. It was about something far deeper, a struggle for credibility, for truth, and for the very protection of national security. Dwayne could feel the weight of his responsibility more acutely now. He wasn't just fighting for the success of this operation. He was fighting for something much bigger. And as the prosecutor and defense prepared to continue their questioning, Dwayne knew one thing for sure. He would do whatever it took to make sure the truth came out, even if it meant facing even more difficult challenges ahead. The silence in the courtroom was thick, almost suffocating. Every moment felt like it stretched into eternity as Dwayne sat in the witness stand, his mind shifting between the present and memories of his time in the field. This wasn't just another day in a courtroom, he realized. This was a pivotal moment in something far larger than any case he had ever been involved in. And in that moment, the weight of it all hit him hard. This wasn't just a matter of national security anymore. It was personal. As the defense and prosecution continued their back and forth, Dwayne's thoughts began to wander back to the days leading up to this trial. They were the days that led him into the heart of a covert operation so complex, so tightly wound, that even now, it was hard to decipher where the lines between public persona and secret agent blurred. Dwayne's every move had been calculated, every decision made under the crushing weight of what was at stake. The threats he had uncovered weren't just theoretical. They were tangible, and the people who stood to benefit from them weren't just faceless criminals. This wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about courtroom games. It was about something far more dangerous. The lives of leaders, the security of the nation, the very people who trusted Dwayne's ability to protect them. The prosecutor's voice snapped him back to the present. "Mr. Johnson, I'd like to ask you about the night of the breach. What exactly happened?" The question hung in the air like a warning bell. Dwayne hadn't expected them to get into specifics so soon, but it wasn't an unexpected move. The night of the breach had been the turning point, the moment everything had gone wrong, and the operation's stakes had escalated. He took a deep breath, letting the memory flood back. The room around him grew silent again, everyone waiting for his response. "It was late," Dwayne began, his voice steady but laced with the weight of memory. "I was assigned to oversee the perimeter security of a sensitive location, one that was believed to be a target for infiltration. Our intel had been clear. A foreign group was planning to breach the compound that night. They had a high-level operative on the inside. We knew they'd stop at nothing to get through." He paused, his mind flashing back to that night. The cold chill in the air, the quiet hum of surveillance equipment, the tension among his team. It had been a race against time. But nothing had prepared him for what came next. "As we secured the compound, I noticed a few discrepancies in our readings," he continued, his gaze flickering to the jurors who were hanging on his every word. "I directed my team to check the backup generators. It was there we found the first signs of tampering, clear signs of sabotage." The prosecutor leaned in, her voice sharp. "Sabotage? You're implying that someone inside the operation was working against you?" Dwayne nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yes, we suspected an inside job." The room fell into a heavy silence. The revelation wasn't something anyone had expected to hear. The thought that there was someone working from within their ranks had sent shockwaves through the team. It had torn apart everything they knew, unraveling their carefully constructed plan. "But how could that have happened?" the prosecutor asked, her disbelief evident. Who could possibly have compromised the operation? Dwayne hesitated for a moment, He had been trained to handle these types of questions, but this one was harder. He had never expected this breach to hit so close to home. The identity of the inside informant had been a closely guarded secret, one that still haunted him. Someone who had been part of the operation, someone he had trusted, had been feeding information to the enemy. The stakes had shifted dramatically. "We didn't know at first," Dwayne finally replied, his voice low. But as the breach unfolded, it became clear that the information had been leaked. Not only were they prepared for our moves, they had anticipated them. It was a game of cat and mouse, and we were losing. The memories were coming back in flashes now. The sense of urgency, the adrenaline pumping through his veins as they tried to regain control. He had seen agents fall that night, people he knew, people he cared about. The chaos had been overwhelming. That night, Dwayne continued, his voice steady despite the emotional toll, we lost more than just time. We lost good agents, and we almost lost the operation itself. But it was during that moment of failure that I realized something. The line between personal and professional, the line between right and wrong, it doesn't always exist. In those moments, all that matters is the mission. And I wasn't about to let anyone down. The courtroom was completely silent now. The intensity of his words, combined with the weight of the situation, had brought the entire room to a standstill. Even the judge seemed to lean forward, his eyes fixed on Dwayne as if he were seeing him for the first time. Dwayne's gaze shifted to the defense attorney, who had been silent since Dwayne's testimony began. Nathan Carter's face was unreadable, but Dwayne could see the wheels turning in his mind. This was the moment. Nathan had been waiting for him to crack, to reveal weakness, to falter. But Dwayne wasn't going to let that happen. Nathan stood slowly, almost deliberately, his posture casual but his eyes sharp. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "let me make sure I understand this correctly. You're telling this court that an operation designed to protect national security was compromised by an inside source? That members of your team were not only targeted, but that the mission was nearly sabotaged from within?" Dwayne met his gaze, unwavering. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying." There was a beat of silence. Nathan's lips curled into a faint smile, the kind of smile that only a skilled attorney could muster. He was preparing to pounce. "And you, Mr. Johnson," Nathan continued, his voice laced with skepticism, "were you aware of this sabotage before it happened? Did you foresee it? Or was it just a matter of you doing your best in a situation you had no control over?" The question was loaded with implication. Nathan was trying to make Dwayne look like a helpless bystander, someone who wasn't truly in control of the operation. But Dwayne wasn't about to let that narrative take hold. "No," Dwayne said firmly, "I wasn't aware of it before it happened. But what I do know is this. We adapted. We regrouped. We worked around the breach and stopped the worst of it. And in the end, we did our job. We protected those who needed it most." Nathan's smile faltered slightly. He could feel the tide turning. Dwayne had remained composed, and that composure was beginning to earn him the respect of the room, especially the jurors. The prosecutor didn't wait for Nathan to continue his questioning. "Mr. Johnson," she interjected quickly, "what happened next? After the sabotage was uncovered?" Dwayne's eyes flickered as he recalled the chaotic aftermath. The phone calls, the last-minute strategy meetings, the hours spent working with other federal agencies to mitigate the damage. It had been a race against time, one that had pushed Dwayne to his limits. But in the end, the operation had been salvaged. The truth was out, and with it came the realization that this fight wasn't just about protecting the nation's leaders. It was about protecting every single citizen who trusted the system. Dwayne sat still in the witness chair, the weight of his words still hanging in the air, thick and unyielding. The moment felt suspended in time. The tension in the courtroom was almost palpable, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The trial had shifted from a simple case of national security to a larger battle, a battle of perception, credibility, and integrity. The defense attorney, Nathan Carter, had been relentless, probing into every detail of the operation, trying to undermine Dwayne's credibility. But there was something undeniable about the way Dwayne carried himself. His testimony was unshaken, each word he spoke carrying the weight of truth. He wasn't just here to testify about the events of that night. He was here to show that the mission had mattered, that the work he did was real, and that no matter how hard the adversaries tried to tear it down, he would stand firm in his commitment to the truth. But even Dwayne couldn't have predicted how quickly things would escalate. The moment that followed his most recent testimony would not only change the course of this trial, it would shatter the carefully constructed facades everyone had been hiding behind. Claire Donovan, the prosecutor, stood at her table, her eyes narrowing as she watched Dwayne. He could see the wheels turning in her mind as she prepared her next line of questioning. She had always been quick on her feet, but even she couldn't have known that the next words out of her mouth would ignite the final spark. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice calm but tinged with an edge of desperation, "you've told us about the breach and the failure of your team to stop it. But I have to ask, what was the cost of this failure? How many people were affected by this supposed compromise? Were any lives lost as a result of your team's inability to prevent this catastrophe?" The question hit like a slap. Dwayne felt his stomach tighten. He knew where this was going. It was the one thing he had been dreading, his failure, exposed for all to see. The very moment he had tried so hard to suppress, the guilt that had gnawed at him in private, now threatened to spill out into the open. The courtroom fell silent again, the air thick with anticipation. Dwayne's pulse quickened as his mind raced back to that night. The faces of his fallen comrades, the lives that had been forever changed. The sound of gunfire, the explosion that had rocked the compound, the desperate cries of those trying to escape. He had failed. He had failed to protect them, and that truth hit him harder now than ever before. The defense lawyer, sensing his opportunity, immediately moved in. "Mr. Johnson, I believe you're not answering the question," Nathan said, his voice cool and calculated. "How many people were lost that night? What is the true cost of the mission?" Dwayne closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to steady his breath. He couldn't allow himself to be rattled. He had to answer. He had to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I'm not proud of what happened that night," Dwayne said, his voice quieter than before. "There were casualties. We lost good agents, good people who were part of our team, people I trusted with my life. But it wasn't just the loss of life that haunted me. It was the loss of control, the moment when everything we'd planned fell apart. It felt like I had failed everyone. I had failed the mission. I had failed the people I swore to protect." The room was still. The weight of his words settled over everyone like a heavy fog. Even the judge, usually composed, appeared somber, his gaze fixed on Dwayne, as though he understood the depth of the sacrifice being revealed. "Mr. Johnson," Claire Donovan's voice broke through the silence, softer now, as though she too was beginning to see the humanity beneath the surface of the agent before her. "You've shared your guilt, but I have to ask, did you have a choice? Were you really in control of what happened? Were you the one pulling the strings? Or were you simply following orders, like everyone else?" The question hit Dwayne like a wave, crashing over him, threatening to pull him under. He had spent his entire life in control, of his career, his actions, his reputation. But now, here, in this moment, his agency, his choices, were being called into question. He wasn't just a witness anymore. He was a man caught in the crossfire of his own conscience. "I had a choice," he answered slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "But the reality is, sometimes we don't know what we're truly capable of until we're put in that position. That night, I did everything I could to protect those around me. But sometimes, even when you give your all, it's not enough. That's the hardest truth I've had to live with." Dwayne's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he felt the weight of the room shift. The skepticism, the questions, everything that had been thrown at him up until now, seemed to fall away. What was left was a man, broken yet resolute, standing before them all and confronting the hardest reality of his life. The room was deathly silent for a long moment. No one spoke. The gravity of what Dwayne had just shared had left them all speechless. But the silence didn't last. Slowly, the sound of Claire Donovan's voice broke through once more. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for your honesty. I understand now that what you've been through is far beyond what anyone in this courtroom could truly comprehend. The sacrifice, the burden, It's something we can't possibly imagine unless we've been there. Dwayne nodded, his gaze fixed on her. He didn't know if she was speaking out of sympathy or respect. All he knew was that her words, though unexpected, gave him a brief sense of peace. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel like a man being judged by his failures. He felt like a man who had fought with everything he had and was simply being allowed to be human. But just as Dwayne began to feel a small spark of hope, the defense attorney stood once more, this time with a new line of questioning that would take this trial in an entirely new direction. His voice, calm yet full of intent, rang out across the room. "Mr. Johnson," Nathan began, his eyes narrowing, "there's something I think you've forgotten to mention. The true reason behind the breach. The real story. Are you ready to tell the court what really happened?" The question was direct, blunt, and dangerous. Dwayne's breath caught in his chest. He could feel the shift in the air. Something dark was about to unfold. This was it. This was the moment everything would change. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Dwayne could feel the eyes of everyone on him, the weight of the question hanging over his head. The defense attorney, Nathan Carter, had just dropped a bombshell. A subtle shift in his demeanor told Dwayne that this was no ordinary question. Nathan wasn't simply trying to discredit him anymore. He was pushing for something far deeper, something Dwayne had feared would eventually come to light. Dwayne's stomach churned. He had been prepared for the usual attacks, the barbs aimed at his credibility, his past, his decisions. But Nathan's question was different. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter in this trial, a chapter Dwayne had desperately hoped would remain closed. The judge's gavel struck sharply, signaling a break in the escalating tension. "Mr. Carter," Judge Harrison's voice rang out, calm yet commanding, "you will refrain from making any further accusations until we are clear about what you mean. Mr. Johnson, do you understand the question?" Dwayne swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, Your Honor." Nathan's eyes were fixed on him, his expression calculated. "Mr. Johnson, I believe there's something you've been withholding. Something that would explain why the breach happened in the first place. It's about the personal connections you had with some of the people involved, isn't it?" The question hit Dwayne like a punch to the gut. His mind raced. Nathan was referring to something. Someone he had tried so hard to keep buried. The operative he had trusted, the one who had been feeding information to the enemy. The moment Dwayne had discovered the betrayal, he had been forced to face the fact that the very people he had relied on most were now his greatest threat. He had told himself that it didn't matter. He was a professional. But the truth was, it did matter. It mattered in ways he had never been able to fully admit. Because it wasn't just about the mission. It was about the betrayal of trust, the feeling of being deceived by someone he had once called a friend. Dwayne cleared his throat, trying to steady his racing heart. The room seemed to shrink around him as his mind flashed back to that night, the realization that someone on the inside had been working against them. The moment he'd known, without a shadow of a doubt, that the enemy was already one step ahead. "It's not what you think," Dwayne finally said, his voice trembling slightly. He was desperate to maintain control, but the raw emotion was too much to suppress. Nathan's smile deepened, knowing that he had Dwayne cornered. "So you admit that there was someone in your operation who betrayed you, but what's the real story? Who was it, Mr. Johnson? Who was the person you trusted with your life, only to have them turn on you?" The words hung in the air, like a gauntlet thrown at Dwayne's feet. His mind flashed to the name. The one name he had been avoiding, the name he feared would surface in this trial. It was the name that had haunted him long after the mission ended. "Agent Carter," Dwayne said quietly, his voice barely audible, but the words cut through the room like a knife. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Claire Donovan's eyes widened, and even Nathan seemed momentarily taken aback. The name hung in the air like a cloud, and the realization hit hard. Agent Carter, his friend, his confidant, the one who had worked alongside him for years, the one who had known his every move, his every weakness, and ultimately had betrayed him. Dwayne could feel the weight of every eye in the room as he let the name settle. He had to finish this, he realized. The truth had to come out, no matter how painful it was. "I never wanted to believe it," Dwayne continued, his voice stronger now. But when the breach happened, I found evidence. Evidence that pointed directly to Agent Carter. It wasn't just a few signs of tampering. It was a full-blown betrayal. He had been feeding information to the enemy. He was part of the very thing we were trying to stop. The room fell silent. Everyone was stunned, the revelation striking like a thunderclap. Nathan Carter's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing as if the weight of Dwayne's words had just become clear to him. He knew the implications of what Dwayne had just admitted. This was no longer just about a failed mission. It was about trust, loyalty, and the dark side of espionage. Dwayne's hands tightened around the edge of the witness stand. His heart was pounding in his chest, but there was no turning back now. This was the truth that had been buried for far too long. I should have seen it sooner, Dwayne said, his voice breaking slightly. I should have realized that something was off, but I didn't. And because of that, we lost people. We lost everything. A soft gasp rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney, Nathan Carter, who had been so sure of himself moments ago, now seemed unsure of how to proceed. He had underestimated Dwayne. He had expected a different response, but this was not the man he had prepared for. Dwayne's eyes shifted to Claire Donovan, who had been watching him carefully. She had known there was more to the story, but this was something none of them had expected. Claire stood, her voice calm but filled with authority. Mr. Johnson, I have to admit that what you've revealed changes everything. I can see now that the events of that night were not just about a botched mission. They were about the personal toll this betrayal took on you. Dwayne nodded, his mind still reeling. I never wanted to admit it, but I was wrong. I was too close to the situation. I trusted someone I shouldn't have, and it cost us. Claire's eyes softened, her voice filled with a mix of sympathy and understanding. But you didn't let that stop you. You didn't give up. You fought to protect the people who mattered. And for that, Mr. Johnson, you have my respect. The words hit Dwayne like a wave of relief. The courtroom was still, but there was a shift in the air. The weight he had been carrying for so long was starting to lift. He had faced his greatest fear, the truth of what had happened that night, and somehow he had survived it. But the battle wasn't over. There was still the question of what would happen next, how this revelation would shape the outcome of the trial. He wasn't sure what would come of it, but for the first time in a long while, Dwayne felt like he was finally starting to breathe again. The court fell into an almost eerie silence as the implications of Dwayne's admission settled over the room. The revelation that Agent Carter, his closest ally, had been responsible for the breach sent shockwaves through everyone present. The momentary calm that followed, however, was deceptive. It wasn't over yet. Dwayne could feel the weight of the future bearing down on him. The courtroom was still digesting what had just been revealed, and the tension was palpable. Judge Harrison shifted in his seat, his gavel poised in the air as if weighing whether to bring order back to the room or allow the moment to linger a little longer. He cleared his throat. Mr. Johnson, I assume that this betrayal you've described is not only central to the case, but will also be addressed in your testimony moving forward. Is that correct? The judge asked, his voice firm but with a note of curiosity. Dwayne looked at him, swallowing the knot in his throat. He nodded. Yes, Your Honor. It's been a difficult truth to admit, but it's essential to understanding the full picture. The room, though still tense, seemed to exhale collectively, but the road ahead was unclear. Claire Donovan, having momentarily set aside her prosecutorial demeanor, gave Dwayne a long look before she rose to her feet. Mr. Johnson, she began, her voice carefully controlled, I appreciate the courage it took to speak the truth. But with the betrayal of a key member of your team now revealed, I have one more question. Why did it take so long for you to act? Why was this information not brought to light sooner? The question struck harder than Dwayne had expected. His chest tightened. It was a fair question, and he had no easy answer. He had wanted to protect his team, to protect the mission, but he had also been too blinded by his loyalty to Agent Carter to see the signs sooner. I didn't want to believe it, Dwayne admitted quietly. Agent Carter was more than just a colleague to me. He was a friend. A trusted friend, but in hindsight, I should have seen the warning signs. I should have questioned the things that didn't add up. But in the heat of the moment, when you're fighting to keep everything together, sometimes you miss the truth staring you right in the face. Claire nodded, as if understanding the conflict Dwayne had struggled with. She wasn't here to make him suffer. She was seeking the truth, just as he was. But her next words still carried the weight of the courtroom. "Mr. Johnson, I understand your feelings of loyalty, but you must realize the consequences of what happened. The lives lost, the impact of the breach. It wasn't just a professional mistake. It was personal. People paid with their lives for your failure to act." Dwayne stiffened. He knew she was right. The cost of his hesitation had been higher than he could ever articulate, but the pain of losing his comrades and friends was something he'd carry with him for the rest of his life. He had never imagined that his actions would be put under such a microscope, dissected until the very core of his choices was exposed. "I know," Dwayne whispered, his voice cracking. "I know." For a moment, no one spoke. The silence in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Even Nathan Carter, usually so sure of himself, seemed to sense the shift in momentum. He was standing there, waiting, probably preparing for his next move, but Dwayne's words had made a significant mark. Finally, the judge cleared his throat, bringing the room back to the matter at hand. "Let's proceed," Judge Harrison said, his tone sharp. "We'll take a short recess before we continue. Mr. Johnson, I suggest you prepare yourself for further questioning." As the gavel came down and the room began to stir with movement, Dwayne felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. The worst had been revealed. The betrayal, his own failures. But the hardest part was still ahead. The consequences of what would happen next, the way this trial would shape the rest of his life, were still uncertain. Outside the courtroom, Dwayne's thoughts raced. The walls seemed to close in on him as he walked through the corridor, trying to collect himself. He was no longer just fighting for his reputation. He was fighting for something far greater, his peace of mind, for redemption. And even as he walked, there was a feeling deep within him, a gnawing sensation, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The courtroom doors opened again, and Dwayne returned to the witness stand. His heart raced. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but he could feel it in the air, the inevitability of it. Claire Donovan had been methodical in her questioning. Nathan Carter was unpredictable. And through all of this, Dwayne still had to fight to regain his dignity and integrity. As the judge called the room back to order, Dwayne was acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom fixed upon him. The pressure felt suffocating, but he couldn't afford to crumble now. This was where it would all either fall apart or come together. The gavel struck again. "Mr. Johnson, you are not yet finished with your testimony," Judge Harrison's voice echoed, commanding attention. "Please continue." It was time for Dwayne to dig deep and face the full weight of his past mistakes. He was ready for it. He had no other choice. The air felt dense as Dwayne settled back into the witness stand. It was as though the weight of the entire courtroom had converged on him. Every eye felt like a laser, piercing through him, analyzing every twitch, every shift of his body. Dwayne had been in high-pressure situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield, a mission where the stakes were only life and death. It was a trial, where his entire existence was being laid bare for the world to scrutinize. Claire Donovan rose from her seat and approached with deliberate steps. Her sharp, focused gaze never left Dwayne. He could feel her probing, waiting for any sign of weakness. The fact that she was no longer the aggressive prosecutor from earlier meant only one thing. She was digging deeper. She had come to terms with the truth Dwayne had admitted, but now she needed to understand why it had taken so long for him to act. "Mr. Johnson," Claire began, her voice even, "you've just revealed that someone you trusted, someone you had known for years, betrayed you. But you also admitted that you failed to act on this information until it was far too late. Why?" The question was as sharp as a blade, and Dwayne felt the sting of it in his chest. The words he had spoken earlier, admitting his failure, were not easy. But now, facing the aftermath of that admission, Dwayne knew he had to dig even deeper to find the courage to continue. The truth was not only painful for others to hear, but it also carried a heavy weight on his shoulders. I couldn't believe it," Dwayne replied, his voice hoarse. I kept telling myself I was wrong, that it wasn't possible, that the man I had fought beside, the man who had my back through thick and thin, couldn't possibly be the one to betray me. I wanted to believe in him, Claire. I wanted to believe that no one would ever be capable of doing something like that to me. Claire's gaze softened for just a moment. That's understandable. But you have to admit, Mr. Johnson, the delay in taking action cost lives. People trusted you to lead, to protect them. And yet, you were paralyzed by doubt. Dwayne's heart twisted at her words. He had heard them before, from those who didn't understand what it was like to be in his shoes, but it didn't make them any less true. The people who had relied on him had paid the price for his hesitation. I know, Dwayne whispered, his head sinking slightly. I failed them. I failed everyone. There was a brief silence. Claire didn't press him further, but Dwayne could sense the weight of her thoughts. She was trying to find the line between holding him accountable for his mistakes and understanding the emotional toll he had endured. She wasn't here to destroy him. Not completely. But there was more at stake than just his personal redemption. The truth about the operation, about Agent Carter's betrayal, had to come to light. Judge Harrison, who had been silent during this exchange, cleared his throat. Mr. Johnson, I must remind you that the focus of this trial is the breach itself. While your personal emotions are certainly valid, we are here to uncover the facts and determine the responsibility of all parties involved. Let us stay focused on the case at hand. Dwayne nodded, grateful for the judge's reminder. He had strayed too far into his emotions, allowing the personal weight of the situation to cloud his focus. This wasn't just about him. It was about the truth. It was about ensuring that Agent Carter's betrayal didn't ruin the lives of everyone who had been caught in its web. I understand, Your Honor, Dwayne replied, steadying himself. Claire, sensing Dwayne's shift back to the task at hand, straightened her posture. Mr. Johnson, you've described the moment you discovered Agent Carter's betrayal. But can you walk us through the events that followed? How did you begin to investigate? What steps did you take to confirm your suspicions? Dwayne closed his eyes briefly, remembering the long, sleepless nights after the discovery. The initial shock had left him numb, but the reality set in soon enough. He had no choice but to confront the ugly truth head-on, even though every part of him had resisted it. Once I found the first piece of evidence, I couldn't ignore it. It wasn't just circumstantial. It was detailed. A sequence of transmissions that traced back to Carter's encrypted files. I started digging into his history, his movements, the people he was in contact with. The more I looked, the clearer it became. He was feeding intel to the enemy. But it wasn't until I found the list of code names, names that only the highest-level agents knew, that I knew for sure. Dwayne's voice grew heavier as he spoke, his emotions still raw from the events that had unfolded. He could almost see it all again, the betrayal etched in his memory like a scar that would never heal. But the real question, Claire, was not just how Carter betrayed me, it was why. And that's what took me the longest to figure out. It wasn't just money or power. It was personal. Carter had been blackmailed. The enemy had something on him, something that he couldn't escape from. Claire's eyes narrowed, her curiosity piqued. What could possibly have been so powerful that it would drive him to betray his own country? Dwayne hesitated for a moment, wrestling with the decision to divulge the details. He had hoped to protect Carter's secret, but now, with everything out in the open, there was no reason to hold back. It was his family, Dwayne finally said, his voice soft but steady. They had his wife, his son. They threatened them. If Carter didn't comply, they would kill them both. It wasn't about greed. It was about fear. Fear of losing the only thing he loved. A hush fell over the room. The revelation that Carter's betrayal had been driven by his love for his family, by the threat of losing them, shocked everyone. It made the situation even more tragic, but it also added a layer of complexity that no one had expected. Claire seemed to take in this new information, her face reflecting a mix of surprise and sympathy. So, you're saying that Carter wasn't entirely acting out of malice. He was forced into it. Dwayne nodded. In the end, yes. But that doesn't excuse what he did. He made the wrong choice. He let his personal emotions cloud his judgment. And because of that, people died. Claire took a step back, considering what Dwayne had just revealed. So, you found out the truth. What happened next? How did you decide to handle it? Dwayne leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. Once I had all the evidence, I knew I had to confront Carter, but I couldn't do it alone. I reached out to the authorities, to the people who could stop him before things got worse. He paused, his mind drifting back to the moment he had gone to his superiors with the evidence. The moment that had led to the chain of events that had turned his life upside down. But Carter was already ahead of me, Dwayne continued. By the time I went to them, he had covered his tracks. He knew what was coming. And before they could arrest him, he disappeared. He vanished without a trace. The courtroom was quiet, everyone digesting the gravity of Dwayne's words. It was a turning point, a revelation that not only explained the depth of the betrayal, but also underscored the tragic personal costs that came with the world they lived in. The truth was out now. The real story, the one that had been buried for so long, was finally on the table. But Dwayne knew this was just the beginning. What happened next would determine whether he could finally put the past behind him and reclaim his future. The courtroom buzzed as the weight of Dwayne's words settled. Claire Donovan stood still for a moment, clearly processing the complexity of what had just been revealed. For a moment, the courtroom had shifted from a place of accusation to one of contemplation. Even Judge Harrison, who had remained mostly neutral throughout the trial, was visibly struck by the unexpected twist. Dwayne's revelation about Agent Carter's blackmail, the threat against his family, had added a layer of humanity to what was once seen as a cold act of betrayal. But for all the sympathy it invoked, it didn't change the reality of the situation. People had died. Lives had been lost because of Carter's actions, and the consequences of those actions were far from over. Claire cleared her throat and stepped forward, her sharp, determined gaze locking onto Dwayne's. She wasn't ready to let him off the hook. Not yet. There was still more to uncover, and she was not about to let this moment of emotional vulnerability sway her. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice still calm but filled with the unmistakable undertone of determination. "You've painted a picture of betrayal driven by fear and desperation. But that doesn't explain everything. Carter's actions were not just about personal survival. They were part of a larger operation. What I want to know is, how did you miss the signs? How did you not see this coming, especially when the stakes were so high?" Dwayne felt the sting of her question. How had he not seen it coming? The answer was simple. He had been blind. Blinded by his loyalty to a friend. Blinded by his belief that some things, like betrayal, were simply not possible among people who had fought side by side in the trenches. "Claire, I don't have an excuse for that," Dwayne said quietly. "I should have seen it sooner. But I didn't want to believe it. It's hard to explain, but when you're that close to someone, when you trust them more than anyone else, it's easy to ignore the red flags." It wasn't just about missing a few details. It was about being too close to the situation to recognize the danger. There was a pause. Claire's eyes narrowed, clearly processing his admission. But instead of pressing further, she gave a small nod, acknowledging that Dwayne had at least been honest about his failure. This wasn't a moment for judgment. It was a moment for truth. But the truth didn't make things any easier. "So, after you realized what Carter was involved in, what did you do?" Claire asked, her voice quieter now, but still laced with the determination that had marked her from the beginning. "How did you plan to stop him?" Dwayne hesitated, gathering his thoughts. This was the part of the story that still haunted him. The aftermath of the discovery, the frantic, sleepless nights trying to figure out what to do next. "I tried to go through the proper channels first," Dwayne replied. "I went to my superiors. I gave them everything I had, every piece of evidence I could find. But it wasn't enough. Carter had already covered his tracks. By the time I got the evidence to them, he was already on the move. And then, he disappeared." Dwayne's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. The memory of that moment, standing in front of his superiors, pleading for them to take action before it was too late, was one that would stay with him forever. It was a moment of failure. A moment when he had watched someone he trusted slip through his fingers. "And that's when it all went south," Dwayne continued. "Carter was already gone. By the time we realized how far he'd gone, it was too late. The operation was compromised, and everything we had worked for began to unravel. The room grew silent as everyone processed what Dwayne had just revealed. The tension was thick, but there was something else, something deeper, more profound. It was the understanding that the story wasn't just about betrayal and survival. It was about the consequences of loyalty, trust, and failure. It was about the cost of blind allegiance. Judge Harrison broke the silence, his voice somber as he addressed Dwayne. "Mr. Johnson, your testimony is troubling, but it does help us understand the gravity of the situation. I think we can all agree that Agent Carter's betrayal, while tragic, was only part of the larger picture. We still need to know what happened after he disappeared. What steps did you take to try and prevent the fallout?" Dwayne took a deep breath, his hands tightening on the edge of the witness stand. This was the hardest part, the part where the consequences of his actions and decisions became undeniable. "I did what I had to do," Dwayne replied, his voice low but steady. "I kept pushing forward, even though everything was falling apart. I couldn't just give up. I couldn't walk away. I kept trying to find Carter, trying to get to the bottom of what he had done before it got worse. But in the end, all I could do was pick up the pieces and try to rebuild the team. Try to restore what we had before the trust was shattered." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of those words hang in the air. The truth was that there was no easy fix, no way to undo what had been done. The damage had been done, and all Dwayne could do now was hope that he could somehow make things right again. "So, you went after him," Claire said softly, more as a statement than a question. "You didn't wait. You took matters into your own hands." Dwayne nodded, his eyes steady on Claire. "I had to. I couldn't let Carter's betrayal destroy everything. I couldn't let him get away with it. Not after everything we had been through together. I had to make sure that justice was served." The room seemed to hold its breath. The implications of Dwayne's words were significant. He had gone rogue, acted outside of the system, in order to stop a dangerous threat. And while his actions may have been driven by a sense of justice, they were also undeniably reckless. Judge Harrison sat back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Mr. Johnson, your actions are raising questions. Questions that will need to be addressed when we move forward. But for now, I think we've reached a crucial point in this case. We'll take another recess before continuing. Let's reconvene in 1 hour." As the courtroom emptied out, Dwayne felt the weight of the trial pressing on him more than ever. He had revealed his darkest moments, his deepest fears. And yet, there was still more to come. More questions. More answers. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet conversations as the recess was called. Dwayne didn't move from his seat, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. His thoughts were a whirlwind, each one tumbling over the next. The weight of the trial was growing heavier with every passing minute. He had just revealed some of the most painful moments of his life. The trust he had placed in Carter, the devastating betrayal, and the actions he had taken afterward. And yet, somehow, it felt as if the real test was only beginning. He didn't have much time to process. Claire Donovan's voice cut through the murmur of the courtroom, and Dwayne looked up to see her walking toward him, her expression unreadable. She wasn't alone. She was flanked by her team of investigators. They were moving with purpose, but there was something in the way she walked that caught his attention. It was the same focused determination she had shown throughout the trial, but now it was tinged with something else, something more personal. "Mr. Johnson," Claire began, standing just a few feet away from him, "I need to ask you something before we reconvene." Dwayne remained still, meeting her gaze. "Go ahead." Her eyes narrowed. Her voice lowered slightly as if to make sure no one else could hear. "You're not telling me everything. There's more to the story, isn't there?" Dwayne blinked, the question catching him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Claire continued, her tone cool but intense, "that you're holding something back. You've told me about the betrayal, about Carter's blackmail, about the steps you took afterward. But there's something in the way you've been speaking, something you're not saying, something you haven't revealed yet." Dwayne felt the familiar weight of guilt pressed down on him. He had come clean about so much, about his failure, about his actions. But there was more. Something deeper. Something darker that he hadn't even been willing to admit to himself until now. He took a breath, his mind racing. Could he really say it out loud? Could he reveal the one thing that still haunted him every day? You're right, Dwayne admitted finally, his voice quiet. There's more. But it's not easy to talk about. Claire's expression softened, just a little, though the intensity of her gaze never wavered. Whatever it is, Mr. Johnson, now's the time to tell me. This trial isn't just about Carter. It's about the consequences of your actions, too. If you want to protect the people you care about, you have to be completely honest. The pressure in Dwayne's chest grew, but he knew she was right. If he wanted any chance of redemption, he couldn't keep hiding the truth. There was a moment, Dwayne began, his voice rough, after I discovered what Carter had done, after I realized he was gone. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about how everything could have been different if I had acted sooner, if I hadn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. But that's not the worst part. Dwayne's words faltered as the memory came crashing back into focus, and the room seemed to spin for a moment. The memory of that night. The moment that had truly changed everything. It wasn't just Carter who betrayed me, Dwayne continued, his voice barely a whisper. I betrayed myself. I let my own guilt and fear make decisions for me. When Carter disappeared, I didn't go after him the way I should have. I didn't take the proper steps. I acted impulsively. I went rogue. Claire remained silent, waiting for him to continue. She didn't interrupt, didn't push. She knew, just like Dwayne, that this moment had been inevitable. The truth always had a way of making itself known, no matter how painful it might be. I thought I could handle it, Dwayne said, his voice breaking slightly. I thought I could clean up the mess, but I was wrong. I hurt people in the process. I made things worse. A silence fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Claire was letting Dwayne process, and he appreciated that. But it also felt like a dam had broken inside him. The confession was out, and now there was no going back. Mr. Johnson, the truth isn't easy, is it? Claire asked softly, her tone a little gentler than before. But you're not the only one who's been affected by what happened. The people you hurt, the ones who are still suffering, can't move on unless you do. Dwayne nodded, his throat tight. I know. I'm trying. I really am. Claire took a step back, glancing over her shoulder at her team. They were standing a little further away, giving Dwayne the space he needed. She turned her attention back to him, her expression serious once more. When we go back into the courtroom, she said firmly, you need to be ready. The defense will use everything you've just confessed against you. They'll try to paint you as a rogue agent who acted outside of the law. You'll be held accountable for your actions. Dwayne nodded again. He wasn't surprised by the bluntness of her words. Claire had never sugarcoated anything, but hearing it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. He had known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to face. I'm ready, Dwayne said, though the words felt hollow. I'll take responsibility for everything I've done. Claire's gaze softened again, but there was still a glint of steel in her eyes. You've got more than just yourself to answer for, Mr. Johnson. But you're not in this alone. You still have a chance to make things right. Dwayne swallowed hard, trying to summon whatever resolve he had left. It was a long road ahead, but he couldn't back down now. Not after everything he had been through. Not after everything he had lost. The sound of the court's bell signaling the end of recess brought Dwayne back to the present. The trial was about to resume, and with it, the consequences of his choices. There was no turning back. The courtroom slowly filled back with the sound of people taking their seats. Dwayne felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but this time, it wasn't just fear. It was resolve. He had confessed the hardest truths, and now, he had to face the consequences. Whatever came next, he would stand tall and take it. For the truth. For justice. For redemption. As the gavel came down, the sound reverberated in Dwayne's chest like a shot to the heart. The courtroom fell into a deep, tense silence. Everyone had returned to their seats, their eyes focused on the judge, waiting for his decision. The air was thick with anticipation, as if time itself had slowed. Dwayne's gaze shifted from the judge to the prosecutor and then to Claire, who was sitting just a few rows behind him, her expression unreadable. The past few days had been a blur of emotions. The trial had gone back and forth, revealing secrets, betrayals, and truths that Dwayne had buried deep. But as much as he had feared the consequences, he knew that this was the moment of reckoning, the moment when everything he had done would either be justified or condemned. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, his voice steady and authoritative as he addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard a great deal of testimony in this case. We have heard from Mr. Dwayne Johnson himself, a man who has admitted to his mistakes and acknowledged the pain his actions have caused. We have heard the accounts of those who have been affected by his decisions, and we have seen the evidence of the consequences." He paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle in. The room was completely still, every single person on edge. "The question before us is not simply one of guilt or innocence," Judge Harrison continued. "It is one of accountability. It is one of understanding the greater implications of the actions taken and recognizing the cost of those actions." Dwayne's breath caught in his throat. The judgment was hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. He had done everything he could to make things right, but no matter how much he wished it, there was no escaping the reality that he had crossed a line. "Mr. Johnson," the judge said, turning his gaze to Dwayne, "you have admitted to acting outside of the law in an attempt to right a wrong. You have shown remorse, and your actions have revealed your desire to make amends. However, there are consequences to taking the law into your own hands. There are consequences to any breach of trust, no matter how well-intentioned." Dwayne felt his heart pounding in his chest. It was as if every word was weighing him down, each syllable dragging him further into the unknown. The judge continued, "As this trial has shown, there were victims. Lives were affected. But there was also a larger picture, one that involved betrayal, fear, and corruption. And while Mr. Johnson did not intend to cause harm, the path he took cannot be justified by good intentions alone." Dwayne swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. He had known this moment would come. He had known that he would have to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how hard it would be. But hearing the judge say it out loud was like being torn open, his soul laid bare before everyone. "In light of the complexities of this case," Judge Harrison said, his tone softening just a little, "and considering Mr. Johnson's admission of guilt, as well as his efforts to take responsibility for his actions, I find that a sentence of probation will be appropriate. Mr. Johnson will be required to undergo counseling, as well as community service, to help him understand the consequences of his decisions. He will be monitored closely, and any further transgressions will result in a more severe sentence." A murmur spread through the courtroom. It wasn't the harsh punishment many had expected. Instead, it was a recognition of the complexity of Dwayne's actions. It was a sentence that acknowledged his remorse, but also held him accountable for the damage he had caused. Claire exhaled quietly behind him, her face a mask of both relief and concern. The punishment wasn't over. There would be work to do, lessons to be learned, but it was a chance for Dwayne to make things right. Dwayne stood up slowly, his knees weak beneath him. He had expected the worst, but this was a punishment he could work with. It wasn't a free pass, but it was a second chance. He had been given an opportunity to rebuild, not just his reputation, but his life. And for that, he would be forever grateful. He turned to face the judge, a quiet acknowledgement in his eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor." Judge Harrison gave a curt nod, then turned his attention to the rest of the court. "This case is adjourned. Court is dismissed." As the room began to empty, Dwayne felt a rush of emotions flood through him. Relief, fear, guilt, and hope all collided inside him in a dizzying rush. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was standing on solid ground again, even if it was only the beginning of a long road ahead. Claire approached him as the crowd started to thin out. She wasn't smiling, but there was a subtle softness to her expression. "You did well," she said quietly. "It wasn't easy, but you did it. You faced your demons, Dwayne. And that counts for something." Dwayne nodded, his throat tight. "I still have a lot to prove. I know that, but I'm going to take this chance. I'm going to make things right." Claire didn't say anything else, but there was something in her eyes that told him she believed him. There was hope in the silence between them, and Dwayne knew that, with her support, he could begin to rebuild not just his life, but the relationships that had been broken along the way. As they walked out of the courtroom together, the weight of the trial still hanging over him, Dwayne felt a strange sense of resolve settling in. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The outside world felt different to Dwayne as he stepped out of the courthouse. The air, though cold, was sharper, fresher, as though the weight of the trial had left his lungs. He squinted at the sun that seemed almost too bright after the heavy clouds of the courtroom. People bustled by, some with purpose, others with the casual pace of a busy day. But for Dwayne, nothing seemed the same. Everything had shifted. Claire had stayed by his side during the final steps of the trial, offering him a quiet presence, but now she was walking beside him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The weight of the conversation they had just had still lingered between them. Dwayne had made it through the trial, but the real challenge was just beginning. "You're free now," Claire said as they paused at the corner, the bustle of the street swirling around them. Her voice was soft but insistent. "But you know this is only the first step." "I know," Dwayne replied, his gaze following a couple of pedestrians passing by. "The probation, the counseling, it's just the start. But I've learned a lot these past few weeks, Claire. More than I thought I would. It's like everything's been building up to this moment. I don't know what's next, but I can't go back to who I was." Claire studied him for a moment, her eyes searching, weighing his words. "You've made mistakes, Dwayne, but you've also acknowledged them. That's more than a lot of people ever do. The real test now is not just avoiding the same mistakes, but making sure you never forget what got you here." Dwayne nodded, feeling the sting of truth in her words. He had been running for so long, running from the consequences of his actions, running from the past, running from his own guilt. But now, he couldn't run anymore. Now, he had to face it all. Not just the trial or the punishment, but the work ahead. "How do I even start?" he asked, the uncertainty in his voice clear. "I mean, where do I even begin to make things right?" "Can I?" Claire smiled, though it was a small one. "It's not going to be easy. Nothing worth it ever is. But the first thing you do is take one step, and then another. You show up every day, even when it feels like it's too much. If you truly want to change, it's in the little moments, the decisions that build your character." Dwayne thought about the people in his life. His friends, his family, the people who had trusted him. How much they had suffered because of his mistakes. The realization was painful, but it also sparked something inside him. A desire to rebuild, to fix what he could. He had always been a man of action, but now he understood that the most important actions were the ones that took time. They didn't have quick results, and they didn't come with instant gratification. They came with patience and consistency. "I've got a lot of work to do," he said softly, looking down at his hands as if to remind himself that the change had to start from within. "That's true," Claire said, her voice warm with understanding. "But you're not alone. You've got people who want to see you succeed, people who will be there to help you. Don't shut them out, Dwayne. You can't do this by yourself." He met her eyes, nodding. Claire had been a steady force throughout this ordeal, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there were still people willing to help. The thought comforted him, even though the weight of everything he had done was far from easy to bear. They walked in silence for a few moments, the sounds of the city all around them. Dwayne had never paid much attention to the noise of the streets before, but now, it felt like a soundtrack to a new beginning, a chance for change. "I'll start with the counseling," he said, his voice more resolute now. "I'll keep my word on that. And the community service. I don't care how hard it gets. I'll show up." Claire gave a nod of approval. "Good. That's exactly what you need. Small steps, Dwayne. Small steps." As they neared her car, she paused and turned to face him. "And what about the people you hurt the most? Have you thought about how you'll make things right with them?" Dwayne hesitated. He hadn't given it much thought. He had been so focused on the trial, on the judgment, that he hadn't considered how to make amends with those he cared about. He thought of his brother, Michael, the one person who had always been there for him. He thought about the strained relationship with his parents, the distance that had grown between them over the years. And then there was Jasmine. Jasmine, the love he had lost, the woman whose trust he had shattered. Her absence felt like an ache that he couldn't ignore. Every decision he made, every step he took, seemed to bring her memory back into focus. How could he ever repair the damage he had done to her? "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know how to fix everything, but I know I have to try. Especially with Jasmine. She deserves better than what I gave her." Claire's eyes softened, her gaze understanding. "You've been through a lot. It's going to take time to rebuild those bridges. But you can start with honesty. Go to them. Own up to your mistakes. It's a hard thing to do, but it's the only way." Dwayne exhaled slowly, a weight still pressing down on his chest. "I will. I'll start with that. It's not going to be easy, but I have to try." Claire gave him a reassuring smile and placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's all anyone can ask for. You're on the right path, Dwayne. Keep going." As she got into her car and drove off, Dwayne stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. But there was something different about it now. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't hiding. He had made the choice to confront his past, to face the people he had hurt, and to start over. It was a long road ahead, but he would take it one step at a time. The next few days felt like a blur. Dwayne had spent the better part of them caught between a whirlwind of paperwork, probation meetings, and the constant pull of his thoughts. Thoughts about what lay ahead and how he could ever undo the damage he had caused. He kept his word, showing up for counseling sessions and getting to work on his community service. But beneath the surface, the real challenge loomed. Confronting the people he had hurt most, the ones who had trusted him. And there was no one he feared facing more than Jasmine. It had been months since he last saw her. The anger, hurt, and confusion that had marred their relationship seemed to have grown in the space between them. He had never intended for things to end the way they did, but that didn't change the reality of it. He had let her down, over and over again. Jasmine had been his anchor, his person. She was the one who believed in him when others didn't. But now, every time he thought about reaching out, he hesitated. He was terrified of her rejection, terrified that he could never make it right. But he had to try. It was the only thing left for him to do. Dwayne had arranged to meet her at the small cafe where they used to go every weekend. He'd always loved how the sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the simple wooden tables. The place was quiet now, a far cry from the bustling afternoons they used to share there. He took a deep breath as he stepped inside, scanning the room for any sign of her. She wasn't there yet, but his stomach churned with anxiety. He tried to steady his hands, forcing himself to look calm as he ordered a coffee and sat down at a table by the window. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. And then, she walked in. Jasmine was as beautiful as he remembered, though there was a coldness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Her long, dark hair was tied back in a ponytail, and she wore a casual jacket over a simple blouse. But it wasn't her appearance that struck Dwayne most. It was the distance between them, the walls that had been built since their last conversation. She spotted him almost immediately and hesitated for a moment before walking over. Her footsteps were deliberate, and when she finally sat across from him, there was an undeniable tension in the air. "Dwayne," she said, her voice cool but not unkind. She hadn't called him by his nickname, the one she used to say in a soft, teasing tone, just his name. It stung more than he expected. "Jasmine," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. He forced himself to look at her, but he could feel his heart hammering in his chest. "I'm glad you agreed to meet me." "I wasn't sure what you wanted," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I didn't know if you were here to apologize again, or if you were just going to make excuses." Dwayne felt a pang in his chest at her words, but he quickly shook his head. "I don't want to make excuses. I know I've hurt you, Jasmine. I know I've broken your trust in ways that might never heal. But I'm here because I owe you more than an apology. I need to own up to what I've done and make sure you know that I've learned from my mistakes." Her eyes softened just a fraction, but the walls were still there, holding her back. "I don't know if I can believe that, Dwayne. It's hard to believe anything you say after everything that's happened. You were the person I trusted the most, and then you just disappeared. You shut me out when I needed you the most." Dwayne nodded, his throat tightening. I know. I've been selfish. I didn't handle things the way I should have. And I know that's on me. But I need you to understand that I've changed. I'm not the same person I was when I walked away. I want to prove that to you, even if it takes time. Jasmine's gaze flickered away from his for a moment, and Dwayne couldn't help but notice the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for her coffee. He knew the hurt was still there. He knew that no matter how much he wanted to make things right, it wasn't going to be easy. But he had to try. He had to prove that he was worth the trust she once gave him. I don't know if you can fix this, Dwayne, she said quietly, her voice tinged with sorrow. I don't know if you can make up for all the times you hurt me, all the times you lied to me. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Dwayne said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of regret. I need you to know that I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding from the truth. I can't undo the past, but I can try to show you who I am now. I'm asking for a chance, not to pick up where we left off, but to prove that I can be someone who deserves your trust again. There was a long silence between them as Jasmine stared into her coffee cup, her fingers tracing the rim. Dwayne could see the war in her eyes, the conflict between the woman she had been and the woman she was now. She had every right to be angry with him, to be resentful. But Dwayne also knew she had the capacity to forgive, to heal, if she wanted to. I don't know what's going to happen between us, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't want you to think that you're the only one who's changed. I've had to change too, Dwayne. I've had to learn to protect myself. He nodded, understanding. He had never asked her to forget what he'd done, or to pretend it hadn't happened. All he wanted was a chance, a small one, to prove that he could be better. I don't expect anything from you, Jasmine, Dwayne said, his voice thick with emotion. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that I'll be here, no matter what you decide. Jasmine looked at him then, really looked at him, as if searching for the truth behind his words. And for the first time, Dwayne felt like he was being seen, not as the man who had made all those mistakes, but as the man who was trying to make things right. I'll think about it, she said quietly, standing up to leave. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm not closing the door just yet. Dwayne watched as she walked out of the cafe, his heart heavy with both relief and uncertainty. The road ahead would be difficult, and he didn't know if they would ever be able to rebuild what they had, but he was willing to try. For the first time in a long while, Dwayne felt like there was hope, not just for him, but for the possibility of healing. Dwayne spent the next few days reflecting on his meeting with Jasmine. Her words echoed in his mind, but they were different from the past. It wasn't the cold dismissal he had feared, but rather a cautious openness. There was still hope, a spark in her heart that hadn't been extinguished by his mistakes. That was something Dwayne would hold on to as he moved forward. But he knew that the road ahead was far from simple. It wasn't just about making things right with Jasmine. It was about proving, to himself and to the world, that he could be someone worthy of trust again. The days that followed the cafe meeting were filled with the regular motions of his new life. He showed up to his counseling sessions, worked diligently on his community service hours, and stuck to the terms of his probation. He didn't feel like he was living. He felt like he was working, rebuilding, step by step. But every time he thought about the future, his mind returned to Jasmine. She was in his thoughts constantly, and he knew that no matter how much time it took, he had to show her that he wasn't the same person who had walked away months ago. It was a rainy Wednesday afternoon when Dwayne received a text message from her. We need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow at 2? I'll be at the old park near your place. His heart skipped a beat. Was this the moment? The moment where everything changed? Or would he face another difficult goodbye? He wasn't sure, but he knew he had to show up. This could be his one chance to prove to her that he was serious about the changes he was making. The next day, Dwayne arrived at the park a few minutes early. The rain had stopped, but the air was still damp and cool, the kind of crispness that made everything feel sharp. The old park was a place full of memories. It was where he and Jasmine used to spend hours talking about their future, their hopes, their dreams. It was the place where their bond had deepened, where they had truly found each other in the midst of their busy lives. As he sat on a bench, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up and saw Jasmine walking toward him, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. She looked just as beautiful as he remembered, but there was a calmness about her now, something different that he couldn't quite place. "Hey," she said quietly as she sat down beside him, the familiar distance between them still present. "Hey," Dwayne replied, his heart thumping in his chest. "Thanks for agreeing to meet me." Jasmine didn't respond immediately. Instead, she just looked at him for a long moment, her gaze intense. Dwayne had to force himself to hold her eyes. It was as if she was trying to gauge whether he was really the person she thought he could be, or whether he was still the man who had hurt her. Finally, she spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the cafe, about how you're different now, how you've changed." Dwayne nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I meant it. I'm not who I was, Jasmine. I've done a lot of work on myself, and I know I still have a long way to go, but I'm not running from this anymore. Not from you. Not from me." Jasmine shifted slightly in her seat, her eyes still on him. "I believe you," she said softly. "I know you're trying, but I need to know, what happens if I let you back in? What happens if I open myself up to you again, only to have you disappear like you did before? How can I trust that you won't just walk away again when things get tough?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, and Dwayne felt the weight of them deep in his chest. He knew that trust couldn't be rebuilt with empty words. He had to show her, through his actions, that he was worthy of it, that he wasn't going anywhere. "I understand your fear," he said, his voice firm but soft. "I've broken your trust, Jasmine, and I can't promise that everything will be perfect, but I can promise you that I won't run away again. I won't turn my back on you or on us. I'm in this for the long haul, no matter how hard it gets. I know I've failed you, but I will never stop trying to make things right." Jasmine was silent for a moment, her gaze drifting to the ground. Dwayne watched as she worked through her emotions, her fingers tracing the fabric of her jacket. He could see the battle in her eyes, the tug-of-war between the love they once shared and the pain he had caused. "Dwayne," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "I'm scared. I'm scared of getting hurt again, but I can't keep living in fear of the past. I have to face it. And if there's even a chance that we can rebuild something, if we can figure out how to move forward, then I'm willing to try." Dwayne's heart soared with relief, but he knew it wasn't the end. It was just another beginning. They had a long road ahead, and it wouldn't be easy. But the fact that she was willing to try, willing to take a chance, meant everything. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "I'll show you, Jasmine. I'll prove that I'm worth the trust you give me." She finally met his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, Dwayne saw a glimmer of hope in her gaze. Not the kind of hope that comes with grand promises or empty words, but the kind that's born from vulnerability and the willingness to move forward despite the scars of the past. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "But I think we both deserve the chance to try." Dwayne smiled, a small, tentative smile, as he reached out and took her hand. It wasn't a promise of anything yet, but it was a start toward healing, toward redemption, toward a future that was no longer defined by his mistakes. The road ahead would be long. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments when it felt like they were back at square one. But Dwayne knew one thing for sure. He wasn't giving up. Not on himself, not on her, and not on the future they could build together, step by step. The next few weeks felt like both a weight and a relief for Dwayne. His relationship with Jasmine had taken a tentative step forward, but he knew it was far from the smooth, carefree connection they once had. There were days when they could talk freely, laugh, and even reminisce about old times. But there were other days when the silence between them felt heavy and unspoken doubts lingered in the air. Dwayne did his best to respect her space, to let her set the pace, and not push for more than she was willing to give. He was learning that rebuilding trust wasn't a linear process. It wasn't something that could be rushed or forced. Every small moment, every word exchanged, every look that said more than it seemed, mattered. He'd started doing more than just fulfilling his legal obligations. He'd started to dig deeper into his own life, his past, and the mistakes that had led him down this destructive path. The counseling had been instrumental, but Dwayne knew it was only the first step. He had to continue working on himself, on being better, not just for Jasmine, but for himself. It wasn't just about mending relationships. It was about figuring out who he truly wanted to be. The thing that kept him going was the thought of Jasmine, even on the difficult days. He kept thinking about the way she had opened up to him, that fragile hope in her eyes. He had to prove to her that she wasn't wasting her time by trusting him again. He would be there for her, every step of the way, no matter how long it took. And then came the call that changed everything. It was late one afternoon when Dwayne's phone rang. He saw the name on the screen and his heart skipped a beat. It was Detective Roberts, the officer who had been involved in the investigation surrounding his case. Dwayne had heard nothing from him for weeks, and now he had to brace himself for whatever news was coming. "Dwayne," Roberts said, his voice tight with urgency, "I need you to meet me tomorrow morning. There's been a development in the investigation. It's important." The words hung in the air like a warning. Dwayne didn't know what to expect, but his gut told him that whatever this was, it would complicate everything. "Where?" Dwayne asked, already bracing himself for bad news. "Meet me at the office. I'll explain everything when you get here. Be there at 10 a.m. sharp." Dwayne hung up the phone, feeling the weight of uncertainty settle over him. What kind of development could there be? Had something gone wrong with his case? Was there a new complication that would throw his entire life into chaos again? He spent the night tossing and turning, his mind racing with possibilities. But no matter how many scenarios he played out in his head, none of them made any sense. He had done everything by the book. He had followed the terms of his probation. He had worked hard to prove he wasn't the person who had spiraled out of control in the past. So why would Roberts call him now, out of the blue? The next morning, Dwayne arrived at the detective's office with a sense of foreboding weighing him down. The city streets outside were busy with the usual morning traffic, but it felt like everything had slowed down in his world. He couldn't shake the sense that something big was about to happen. When he entered the detective's office, he was greeted by Roberts, who motioned for him to sit. "Dwayne," the detective began, his tone serious, "I know you've been doing everything right. You've been fulfilling your obligations. But there's something you need to know. Something that's about to shake everything up." Dwayne sat up straighter, his stomach tightening with nerves. "What is it? What's going on?" Roberts paused for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "We've uncovered new information regarding the case you were involved in. It turns out there's more to the story than we initially thought." Dwayne's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? I thought everything was clear. I thought we settled everything." "That's what we thought," Roberts said, running a hand through his hair. "But there are connections, ties to some people we didn't know about. The people who were pulling the strings behind the scenes. There's a chance that they're still out there. And they've been watching you." Dwayne felt the blood drain from his face. He had always assumed that once his case was over, once he was on probation, everything would be behind him. But now, it seemed like it was far from over. "What are you saying? Are they coming after me?" Dwayne asked, his voice shaky with anxiety. Roberts nodded. "We think so. We believe they might have been keeping tabs on you, using your past as leverage. And now that you're trying to turn your life around, they might see you as a threat. We're investigating further, but I wanted you to know." Dwayne felt the room closing in on him. All of the progress he had made, the steps he had taken toward redemption, suddenly seemed so fragile. He had been living his life, trying to rebuild what he had lost. But now he was being pulled back into a world of shadows, a world of people who never let go. "Why tell me this now?" Dwayne asked, his mind spinning. "Because we're going to need your help," Roberts replied, his tone urgent. "You have to be aware of the danger. And if you have any information that could help us track them down, we need you to share it." Dwayne didn't know how to process everything. He had come to this office to seek closure, to move forward, but now he was being thrown back into a world he had tried so desperately to leave behind. "I'll do what I can," Dwayne said, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know if he was ready for whatever was coming next, but he had no choice. This was his reality now. He would have to face it, no matter how impossible it seemed. As he left the detective's office, his mind was racing. The quiet life he had been building with Jasmine, the peace he had worked so hard to achieve, was it all just a fleeting illusion? Was he truly free from his past, or was his past still hunting him, waiting for the right moment to strike? And worse yet, what did it mean for the fragile relationship he was rebuilding with Jasmine? Could he truly protect her from the dangerous people who still held power over his life? Dwayne wasn't sure of the answers, but one thing was clear. His fight for redemption was far from over. Dwayne barely slept the night after his conversation with Detective Roberts. His mind was clouded with the implications of what he had just learned. He had thought that his past was something he could control, that the wrongs he had committed were in the rearview mirror. But now, it seemed that the shadows of his former life weren't ready to let him go. The next morning, as he went through his routine, every step felt like it carried the weight of the unknown. He thought about Jasmine, and for the first time in a while, the fear of losing her wasn't just about his past mistakes. It was about the danger that seemed to be circling back into his life. He didn't want her to get caught up in any of it. She had been through enough, and he couldn't let her be dragged down with him. He texted her that morning, telling her he needed to see her. He couldn't keep this secret from her. If they were going to move forward, she had to understand the gravity of the situation. They agreed to meet at the same park where they had talked last time, the familiar space where so much had already been said and unsaid. Dwayne arrived early, his thoughts swirling with worry and doubt. The rain had started again, a soft drizzle that coated everything in a thin layer of moisture. It felt like the sky was reflecting his mood, gray, heavy, uncertain. When Jasmine arrived, she looked at him curiously. Her face was calm, but Dwayne could see the slight furrow of her brow that told him she knew something was off. She had always been able to read him, even when he didn't want to be read. "What's going on?" she asked as she sat down beside him, pulling her coat tighter around herself to shield from the chill. Dwayne sighed deeply. He had rehearsed what he was going to say a dozen times in his head, but now that the moment had come, the words didn't feel enough. He turned to her, his gaze earnest but filled with hesitation. "Jasmine, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice a mix of fear and resolve. "I found out some things I wasn't prepared for, and I think you need to know, because it's going to affect both of us." She looked at him, her eyes wide with concern. "What are you talking about?" "I've been trying to put my past behind me," he continued, his voice thick with the weight of his confession. "But some people from that life, people I thought I was done with, they're still out there. They're watching me, and I don't know what they want yet, but I'm scared. Scared for you. Scared for me." Jasmine remained silent for a long moment, processing his words. Dwayne could feel her gaze on him, her mind working through the revelation. He could see the wheels turning in her head, the realization dawning that this wasn't just some vague threat. It was real. "Dwayne," she said quietly, her voice filled with both concern and disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why keep this from me?" "I didn't want to pull you back into it," Dwayne replied, shaking his head. "I thought I could protect you from all of this, but I was wrong. You deserve to know the truth. You deserve to know what's at stake here. I won't drag you into it, but I can't keep you in the dark either. You're too important to me." Jasmine's face softened, and for a moment, Dwayne could see the familiar warmth in her eyes. But it was quickly replaced by something else, something that felt like fear, but also a sense of resolve. She reached out and took his hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "I don't know what you've gotten yourself mixed up in, Dwayne," she said, her voice steady, "but I'm not going to run away from you. Not now, not when you need me the most. We'll figure this out together." Dwayne's chest tightened with emotion. He had never expected this kind of support from her, not after everything that had happened. He had assumed she would pull away, that his past would be the final straw. But here she was, offering him her hand when he needed it most. "I don't deserve you," he whispered, the words feeling raw in his throat. Jasmine shook her head, her eyes filled with understanding. "You don't have to deserve me, Dwayne. You just have to keep being the man I know you can be. We'll face this together." Dwayne looked at her, feeling a mixture of gratitude and awe. She had always been the person who had seen the best in him, even when he couldn't see it in himself. And now, as he looked at her, he realized that he was willing to do anything to keep that trust, to keep her in his life. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Jasmine smiled softly, her grip on his hand tightening. "I'm not giving up, but we need to be smart about this. You're not in this alone anymore, Dwayne. We'll fight this together. But we need to be cautious. Whatever these people are after, we can't let them get to us." Dwayne nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He had never felt more determined. The path ahead was uncertain, and the risks were greater than he had ever imagined. But with Jasmine by his side, he finally felt like he could face whatever was coming. Over the next few days, Dwayne and Jasmine worked together, trying to gather as much information as they could. They both knew that going to the authorities with everything they knew would be a step towards safety, but they also understood the gravity of the situation. The people who were watching him weren't just ordinary criminals. They were connected, dangerous, and had the power to make anyone who stood in their way disappear. Dwayne's mind kept returning to what Roberts had said. They needed him to help, but how could he help when he didn't even know who to trust anymore? That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Dwayne made a vow to himself. He wasn't going to let fear control his life. He had already lost too much, and now he had something to fight for. He had something worth saving. Dwayne couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the worst was yet to come. The moment he'd confided in Jasmine, a wave of relief had washed over him, but it had only been temporary. Every conversation since then, every glance in her direction, only deepened the weight he carried. He knew, deep down, that keeping her in the loop was the right thing to do. But it also meant exposing her to something far darker than anything he had ever imagined. They had agreed to take things slowly. They needed more information, more clarity on who was behind the recent threats. Detective Roberts had promised to update them as soon as they uncovered something new, but there hadn't been any breakthroughs. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Jasmine, ever the practical one, had suggested they start looking into security measures for their homes. It wasn't a comfortable conversation, one where Dwayne found himself considering just how vulnerable they were, but it was necessary. He didn't want to take chances, not with her safety. That night, he found himself sitting in his apartment, staring out the window as the city hummed below him. The lights of the buildings glowed like distant stars in the cold February night. He hadn't been able to escape the feeling that someone was watching him, a constant tension in the air that made his skin crawl. He tried to push it aside, focus on the work that needed to be done, but it was always there, just beneath the surface. The phone call came as a shock, breaking his trance. It was Detective Roberts. "Dwayne, you need to get to my office. Now." His heart began to pound in his chest. There was no greeting, no explanation. Robert's voice was sharp, filled with an urgency Dwayne hadn't heard before. "What's going on?" Dwayne asked, immediately on edge. "I can't explain over the phone," Roberts replied, his tone clipped. "Just get here. We have a situation." Dwayne didn't waste another second. He grabbed his jacket and rushed out the door, every step heavier than the last. He had no idea what was coming, but the detective's tone told him this was different. Whatever it was, it had to be big. As he drove through the streets toward the detective's office, his thoughts raced. Could it be that they had finally found something solid? Or worse, could someone have targeted Jasmine? The uncertainty twisted his insides, making it hard to focus on the road. When he arrived, Roberts was waiting for him outside the building. His face was grim, a far cry from the usual professionalism Dwayne had seen in the past. There was no small talk, just a quick nod and a motion for Dwayne to follow him inside. "Everything okay?" Dwayne asked as they ascended the stairs to the office, his mind running in circles. Roberts didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the door to his office and motioned for Dwayne to enter. The room was dark except for the harsh glow of a desk lamp illuminating a stack of files. Several papers were scattered across the desk, and Dwayne could see a map on the wall, marked with red circles and lines. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Something was off. Roberts closed the door behind them and locked it. "Sit down," he instructed, his voice low and serious. Dwayne didn't hesitate. He sat across from the detective, his heart in his throat. "Listen, Dwayne," Roberts began, running a hand through his hair. "We've been tracking some leads. The people behind all of this, whatever you want to call it, are more connected than we thought. They have resources. And we've just found something that ties them directly to you. Dwayne's stomach lurched. He had expected a lot of things, but not this. Wait, what do you mean, directly to me? Dwayne asked, his voice rising slightly. Roberts leaned in, his eyes narrowing. They've been keeping tabs on you longer than we realized. And we've uncovered a connection, something they've been hiding in plain sight. Dwayne, you're not just a victim of circumstance. You're a target. And this isn't something that's going away. Dwayne swallowed hard, trying to process the magnitude of Robert's words. Target? But I'm doing everything by the book. I've been staying clean. I don't understand. Why me? The detective's gaze softened, but only slightly. It's not about your actions now. It's about who you were and what you know. Your past is a threat to them, and they've been trying to eliminate any risks, anyone who could expose them. Dwayne's mind raced, but before he could ask more questions, Roberts stood up, pacing around the room. He motioned toward the stack of papers on the desk. We've been piecing this together for weeks, Roberts continued. The people behind this are not ordinary criminals. They've been involved in organized crime, corporate corruption, and more. The last thing they need is someone like you, someone who knows their secrets. Dwayne leaned forward, his thoughts racing. So, what's the next step? What are we doing about it? Roberts turned and faced him. We're going to need you to take an active role in this. We need you to help us get closer to the people in charge. We don't have enough to take them down completely, but if we can get you to work with us, we might have a shot. Dwayne's chest tightened. The weight of the situation was overwhelming. He had been trying so hard to move past everything, to live a life that was simple, peaceful, but it seemed the universe had other plans. I don't know if I can handle this, Roberts, Dwayne confessed, his voice strained. I'm not the same person I was. I'm trying to rebuild. And now you're asking me to put myself in danger again? Roberts gave him a hard look. I get it. I really do. But this isn't just about you anymore. This is bigger than any one of us. We need you, Dwayne. You can't walk away from this. Dwayne ran a hand through his hair, his mind a whirl of thoughts. He was torn between his desire to protect the life he had started to rebuild, his fear for Jasmine's safety, and the overwhelming pressure of doing the right thing. I'll help, he said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. But you better promise me something. Anything, Roberts replied without hesitation. You keep Jasmine out of this. She's been through too much already. I won't drag her into this mess. Not now. Roberts nodded, his expression serious. Understood. We'll keep her out of it as best we can. Dwayne took a deep breath, then stood up. This was it. The point of no return. His fight for redemption had just become something far more dangerous. And now, there was no turning back. Dwayne's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as he left Detective Roberts' office. The promise he had made to himself, to protect Jasmine and keep her safe, felt like an anchor weighing him down. He had already let so much slip from his grasp in the past. This time, he wasn't about to let anything else slip through his fingers. But Roberts was right. He was already in this deep. The past was coming back, and no matter how much he wished it away, it wouldn't go quietly. As Dwayne walked through the dark, empty streets, the weight of his decisions pressed heavily on his chest. He knew the stakes were higher now. Helping the detective wasn't just about protecting himself or getting revenge anymore. It was about uncovering the truth. It was about stopping these people from hurting others, from spreading their dangerous influence any further. But he had one question lingering in his mind. How far was he willing to go to stop them? The car ride back to his apartment was a blur, his mind too occupied with the conversation he had just had to focus on the road. The streets passed by like a movie he was watching but couldn't quite follow. The dull glow of streetlights flickered against the foggy windows, and Dwayne's grip on the steering wheel tightened as a sense of dread settled in his gut. He was in too deep now. There was no turning back. As he parked in his usual spot, the tension in his chest only grew. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Jasmine. How did the meeting go? Call me when you get home. Dwayne stared at the screen for a few moments, fighting the urge to respond immediately. She had been nothing but supportive through this entire ordeal, but what could he say now? What more could he tell her? The last thing he wanted was to worry her more than she already was. Taking a deep breath, he typed out a response. Meeting went well. I'll explain everything soon. Promise. It wasn't much, but it was the truth, at least part of it. He knew he couldn't shield her from the reality of the situation forever, but he also didn't want to put her in the middle of it just yet. She had enough on her plate as it was. He owed her more than that. As Dwayne entered his apartment, the silence was deafening. The familiar sounds of his everyday life, his footsteps on the hardwood floors, the hum of the fridge, the distant noise of the city outside, felt distant now. Everything had changed in the span of just a few days. The calm of his apartment was a far cry from the storm brewing just beyond his door. He sat down on the couch and ran his hands through his hair, his mind still racing. The detective's words echoed in his mind. They're after you because you know their secrets. He didn't know how much longer he could keep this up. He was starting to feel the cracks beneath the surface. The constant tension, the fear, the feeling of being hunted. It was beginning to take its toll on him. And he hadn't even started playing the game yet. The phone buzzed again, this time a call from Jasmine. He hesitated for a moment before picking up. Hey, he said, his voice sounding more distant than he intended. Hey, what's going on? Jasmine's voice was soft but filled with concern. You're not telling me everything, Dwayne. I can hear it in your voice. What did Robert say? Dwayne's chest tightened. He had promised he'd explain. But how could he? How could he put all of this into words without pushing her away? How could he protect her and let her in at the same time? I can't talk about it right now, he said, struggling to keep his tone steady. It's too dangerous. I'll explain everything soon. I just need to figure a few things out first. Jasmine was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing softly through the phone. She wasn't buying it. I don't want you keeping secrets from me, Dwayne, she said, her voice unwavering. I'm in this with you, whether you like it or not. You're not alone in this fight. I don't care how dangerous it gets. Dwayne felt a rush of warmth flood through him at her words, but it was quickly replaced by the nagging doubt that had been growing inside of him. He knew she meant it, but how long could he keep her safe while dragging her into the very heart of the storm? I know, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, but I need to make sure it's safe first. I don't want you getting hurt because of me. I'm already in this, Dwayne, she replied softly. Don't push me away. We'll face it together. But you need to trust me. Her words hit him harder than he expected. Jasmine had always been the stronger one, the one who held everything together. She had always believed in him, even when he had trouble believing in himself. And now, when he needed her the most, she wasn't backing down. I trust you, Jasmine, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm just trying to figure out the best way to protect you. There was a long pause, and for a brief moment, Dwayne wondered if she had hung up on him. But then, she spoke again, her voice soft and reassuring. Just know this, she said, her tone steady. You don't have to do this alone. Not now, not ever. Dwayne closed his eyes, the weight of her words hitting him like a ton of bricks. He had always prided himself on protecting the people he cared about, but maybe it was time he let someone protect him too. He had spent so much time keeping people out, pushing them away to keep them safe. But Jasmine wasn't asking for his protection. She was asking to stand by his side. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He couldn't keep running from his past forever. He had to face it. But maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have to do it alone. He took a deep breath and steadied himself. The waiting game was over. It was time to act. I'll keep you updated, he said, his voice more certain now. I promise. As they hung up, Dwayne stared out of the window once again. The rain had stopped, and the streets outside looked almost peaceful, as if the world had momentarily forgotten the storm brewing beneath the surface. But Dwayne hadn't forgotten. He couldn't afford to. Tomorrow, things would change. He was done waiting. The morning light streamed through the blinds, casting long shadows across Dwayne's living room. He hadn't slept much the night before. How could he? The weight of everything pressing down on him, the fear of what might come next, left him staring at the ceiling for hours. It was like his mind couldn't catch up with the reality he was living. One minute he was trying to put his past behind him. The next he was tangled in a web that he didn't fully understand yet. Dwayne sat at the kitchen table, the untouched cup of coffee in front of him growing cold. His phone had buzzed a couple of times, but he hadn't looked at it. He wasn't ready. Not yet. It was only a matter of time before they made their next move, and he had to be prepared. He had to stay one step ahead. But even with all the training, all the experience, the uncertainty of it all gnawed at him. This wasn't like anything he had faced before. Just as he was about to pick up his phone, it rang. It was Detective Roberts. Dwayne answered without hesitation. "What's going on?" "We've got a lead," Roberts said, his voice quick and urgent. "I need you to meet me at the usual place. Now." The words hit Dwayne like a punch to the gut. The usual place. The place where everything had begun to go sideways. He didn't hesitate. The adrenaline kicked in, and he was already grabbing his jacket, ready to go. "I'm on my way," he said, hanging up without waiting for a response. As he drove toward the location Roberts had given him, the familiar knots of anxiety formed in his stomach. The city passed by in a blur, and for a moment, Dwayne found himself wondering if he had made a mistake. There had been times in his life when he had faced challenges, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about protecting everything he had worked so hard to rebuild. By the time he arrived, Roberts was already standing outside, leaning against a parked car. His posture was tense, his eyes scanning the area as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. "Dwayne," he greeted, his expression serious. "We've traced some of the calls and emails we've intercepted. They're coming for you. But we found something even bigger." Dwayne frowned. "What do you mean bigger?" Roberts gestured for him to follow as they entered a nearby building. Inside, the place was dimly lit, with an air of neglect hanging in the stale atmosphere. It wasn't much, but it had the feeling of a place where people kept their secrets. "We've been digging deeper into the connections between these guys," Roberts explained as they walked down a narrow hallway. "And it turns out they've been hiding in plain sight. It's not just about you anymore, Dwayne. They've moved on to someone else." Dwayne's chest tightened. "What do you mean, someone else?" Roberts stopped in front of a door and unlocked it. Inside, the room was filled with maps, files, and photographs. A wall was covered with pictures connected by red string, like something out of a detective novel. "It's Jasmine," Roberts said quietly, turning to Dwayne with a serious look on his face. "She's been on their radar. She's in more danger than you realize." Dwayne's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about? How?" "Her father," Roberts continued, his voice dropping to a lower tone. "He's connected to this whole operation. I didn't want to tell you this yet, but we've traced it all back to him. He's not just some innocent businessman." The revelation hit Dwayne like a slap to the face. He had always known that Jasmine's family wasn't exactly the picture-perfect example of virtue, but this was something else entirely. "I'm sorry, Dwayne," Roberts said, his expression apologetic. "But Jasmine's father is one of them. He's involved in this mess. And the deeper we dig, the more we realize how dangerous it is." Dwayne couldn't process the words. Jasmine's father? How could this be happening? How could someone so close to her be involved in such dark dealings? And how had he not seen it sooner? He turned away from the wall of photographs, his mind racing. He had to protect Jasmine. He had promised her that he would keep her safe. But now, the enemy wasn't just lurking in the shadows. The threat had been in plain sight all along, and it was far closer than he had ever imagined. "We can't let her get involved in this," Dwayne said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have to keep her out of this. She deserves to be safe." Roberts nodded. "I agree. But at this point, it's not just about protecting her. It's about stopping her father and the people behind him before they cause more damage." Dwayne felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had been trying to fight for a future with Jasmine, a future that was free of his past mistakes. But now, that future was in jeopardy. The deeper they got into this, the more dangerous it became. "We need a plan," Dwayne said, his voice low and determined. "We need to get ahead of this before it spirals further out of control." "We're already doing what we can," Roberts said, his eyes darkening. "But we need your help more than ever. These people are powerful, and they won't hesitate to hurt anyone standing in their way. If we don't act fast, we risk losing everything." Dwayne's mind was racing. The decision was clear. He had to act fast. There was no more time to waste. Jasmine needed to be kept out of harm's way, and Dwayne needed to find out just how deep this web of lies and corruption really went. He turned to Roberts with a steely resolve. Let's end this. Whatever it takes. Roberts nodded and began pulling files off the desk, sorting through them quickly. We need to act fast. But before we do, there's one more thing. Dwayne raised an eyebrow. What? Roberts met his eyes, his voice grim. We need to find Jasmine's father. And when we do, we need to be ready for anything. Dwayne's jaw tightened. He hadn't come this far to back down now. He had made his choice, and he wasn't about to let anything, especially not his past, stand in the way of protecting the people he loved. But as he stepped closer to the files on the table, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation had just gotten far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. And they were running out of time. The air felt thick with tension as Dwayne and Detective Roberts went through the files scattered across the table. The photos of Jasmine's father, Richard Collins, were unsettling. He didn't look like the kind of man who would be involved in something so sinister. He was always seen as a wealthy, well-respected businessman, someone who had built an empire with his own hands. But these photos painted a different picture, one that Dwayne wasn't sure he was ready to accept. There's more to this than I thought, Dwayne muttered, his voice grim as he flipped through the papers. Collins isn't just involved. He's at the center of it all. Roberts nodded, his expression as serious as ever. That's right. We've traced his connections to several high-profile organizations, all with links to illegal arms deals and money laundering. And it doesn't stop there. Dwayne's mind raced. He had always suspected that there was more to Richard Collins than met the eye, but this was beyond what he could have imagined. How could Jasmine's father be connected to a network like this? How could he have been hiding this for so long? We've been trying to piece together the puzzle, Roberts continued, and we've got a lead on one of their operations. It's in the works for tonight. We need you on the inside. Dwayne felt a chill run down his spine. Inside? What do you mean by that? We've got intel that Collins will be meeting with several of his associates tonight at a warehouse in the industrial district. We're going to send in a team to intercept them, but we need someone to get close to Collins, someone who can gain his trust. Dwayne shook his head. You want me to walk right into their den of vipers? Do you have any idea how risky that is? Roberts looked at him dead in the eye, his voice unwavering. You've been inside their world before. You've played the game. And you're the only one who has the skills to pull this off. This could be our only chance to bring them down for good. The weight of the situation settled heavily on Dwayne's shoulders. He had always walked the line between right and wrong, but this was different. If he got too close to Collins, if he played this game too well, he risked losing himself in the process. He had to keep his focus. His goal wasn't just to infiltrate. It was to protect Jasmine and stop the operation. He looked over at Roberts, who was already pulling together the final details for the mission. All right, Dwayne said after a long pause. I'll do it, but if I'm going in there, I need everything you've got on Collins and his people. No more secrets. Roberts nodded. You'll have everything you need. We've already planted surveillance in the area. You'll have eyes on you the whole time, but you need to move fast. If you hesitate, it could blow the whole operation. The plan was set. Dwayne couldn't afford to waste any more time. He had no choice but to follow through. He didn't know what he'd find once he got inside, but he knew one thing. The deeper he got into this, the more dangerous it became for everyone he cared about. And Jasmine? She had no idea how close to the edge they were standing. The ride to the industrial district was silent. Dwayne's thoughts were a whirlwind, but he couldn't afford to let them get the best of him. He had a job to do. The team had set up surveillance points, hidden cameras, and listening devices all around the warehouse. It wasn't the perfect setup, but it was their best shot. As he neared the location, Dwayne checked his watch. It was almost time. The shadows of the evening grew longer, and he could see the outline of the warehouse in the distance, an ominous, looming structure. The closer he got, the more his pulse quickened. He was walking right into the heart of the operation, and he had to keep his wits about him. The plan was simple. Get inside, gather intel, and get out before things went south. But things never went as planned. especially when dealing with people like Collins. Dwayne parked a few blocks away and made his way to the entrance on foot. He was dressed in dark clothes, blending in with the night. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the alleyway, and his breath came out in quick bursts. He was already on edge, but he couldn't let it show. He had to remain calm. Reaching the entrance, he paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the large steel doors. The place looked like any other warehouse, old, industrial, and seemingly abandoned. But Dwayne knew better. It was a fortress, and he was about to step inside. He checked his phone. The team was in place. Roberts would be monitoring everything from the van parked a few blocks down. It was now or never. With a steady hand, Dwayne reached for the door, pushing it open slowly. The creak of the hinges seemed to echo through the quiet night, but he didn't flinch. He stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, and the smell of metal and oil filled the air. He could hear voices coming from the far end of the warehouse, muffled by the thick walls. As he made his way forward, he kept to the shadows, moving silently, listening for any sign that he was being watched. The voices grew louder as he neared the meeting area. Dwayne pressed himself against the cold concrete wall, trying to steady his breathing. There was no turning back now. Suddenly, he heard a voice he recognized. "Collins, you've kept us waiting long enough." It was a man Dwayne had tangled with in the past, one of Collins' top lieutenants. The man's voice was rough, and his tone was laced with irritation. Dwayne held his breath, waiting for the sound of Collins' response. "I don't like being rushed," came Collins' voice, smooth and controlled, though tinged with the arrogance that Dwayne had heard so many times before. Dwayne's heart skipped a beat. There it was. Collins. He had found him. With a deep breath, Dwayne stepped out of the shadows, ready to put his plan into motion. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. The game had officially begun. But just as he made his move, a voice from behind him stopped him cold. "Dwayne?" His blood ran cold. He turned slowly, his heart sinking into his stomach. It was Jasmine. Dwayne's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to face Jasmine. She stood there, just a few feet away, her eyes wide with shock, a mixture of disbelief and confusion etched across her face. "Jasmine, what are you doing here?" Dwayne's voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it carried an urgency he couldn't hide. She took a step forward, her gaze never leaving his. I should be asking you the same thing. What the hell is going on, Dwayne? Why are you here? Why didn't you tell me about all this?" Her voice trembled with a combination of fear and frustration. Dwayne's mind raced. This was the last thing he wanted. Jasmine getting pulled into this mess. She was supposed to be safe, away from the chaos he had willingly walked back into. He had promised her that he would protect her from this life, from the dangers that haunted his past. But standing here, facing her in this cold, grimy warehouse, everything he had worked for felt like it was slipping through his fingers. "I didn't want you to be involved in any of this," Dwayne said, stepping closer to her, keeping his voice as calm as he could manage. "I thought I could handle it myself. But it's bigger than I thought. And now you're here, and that changes everything." Jasmine's eyes searched his face, her brows furrowed as she tried to make sense of the situation. "I don't understand. What is all this? What do you mean, bigger than I thought?" "You've been lying to me, Dwayne. All this time. You've kept things from me. I deserve the truth, don't I?" The words hit Dwayne like a slap, but he knew she was right. She deserved the truth. She deserved to know everything, even if it meant losing her. Because if he didn't tell her now, there was no way he could protect her from the dangers that were closing in on them. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But you're not supposed to be here, Jasmine. This is dangerous. These people, they're dangerous. You have no idea what you've walked into." She shook her head, the anger in her eyes giving way to something deeper, something that cut Dwayne to the core. "You think I don't know danger? You think I've been living under a rock? My entire life has been one big lie, Dwayne. The truth is, I've always been in the dark about my father, about who he really is. But now that I'm here, I want to understand. I want to know what's really going on. And I want to help." The determination in her voice left Dwayne speechless. He had underestimated her, again. Jasmine was stronger than he had ever given her credit for. But this was a battle she wasn't ready for. You don't need to help, Dwayne said, his voice firming as he took a step back. You need to get out of here. Right now. Go home, Jasmine. I'll take care of this. I can't let you get dragged into this mess. But she didn't move. Instead, she looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. You're not the only one who can fight, Dwayne. I know I'm not trained for this, but I'm not just some helpless bystander. You've never trusted me enough to let me in, but I'm not running away from this. Not again. Dwayne stared at her for a moment, his mind screaming at him to get her out of here, but something deep within him couldn't bring himself to make her leave. He could see it in her eyes. She wasn't going anywhere, and he couldn't protect her if she was always in the dark. Reluctantly, Dwayne nodded. All right, but you stay close to me. If things go south, you get out of here. You hear me? Jasmine's gaze softened for a split second before she nodded in return. I hear you, but I'm not afraid. A sudden noise broke the tension between them. A door creaking open in the distance, the sound of footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the warehouse. Dwayne froze, instinctively reaching for the small earpiece in his ear, signaling to Roberts and the team. We've got company, Dwayne muttered under his breath. Get ready. Jasmine's eyes widened, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she moved closer to him, her resolve steeled. They had no choice now. This was it, the moment of reckoning. Dwayne gestured for her to follow him as he moved toward a stack of crates at the far end of the warehouse, his every sense on high alert. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He couldn't risk anyone finding them yet, not until he knew exactly what they were walking into. As they ducked behind the crates, Dwayne's mind was racing. The situation had gone from bad to worse in a matter of minutes. Jasmine was here, and now there was no turning back. If they were caught, the consequences would be severe, not just for him, but for her too. He could hear voices now, coming from the other side of the warehouse. Colin's men. They were talking, their words muffled by the thick walls. But Dwayne could pick up the occasional mention of the shipment, of plans to move large quantities of goods under the cover of darkness. This is it, Dwayne whispered to Jasmine, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his side. We need to move fast, gather what we can, and get out of here. Just as he was about to move forward, a loud bang echoed through the room. A door was kicked open somewhere on the other side, and voices suddenly erupted in a chaotic frenzy. It wasn't just Colin's men anymore. Someone else was here. Dwayne. Robert's voice came through the earpiece, urgent. They've got backup. You need to move now. The air was thick with the sound of shuffling feet and frantic shouting. Dwayne looked at Jasmine. He didn't have time to explain. They had to act fast. Stay close, Dwayne ordered, gripping her arm and pulling her toward a side exit. We're not alone in here. As they moved through the darkness, the sound of shouting grew louder, and Dwayne's heart raced. The walls of the warehouse seemed to close in on them, the stakes escalating with every passing second. They were no longer in control of the situation. Just as they reached the back exit, a shot rang out. Dwayne's world seemed to slow down. He looked back in time to see one of Colin's men, gun raised, just as another shot rang through the air. But this time, it wasn't aimed at Dwayne. It was aimed at Jasmine. The bullet flew toward her with terrifying speed. Time seemed to freeze as the bullet hurtled toward Jasmine. Every muscle in Dwayne's body screamed to act, to protect her, to do anything to stop the inevitable. He barely had time to think, only to move. Without a second thought, he lunged forward, knocking Jasmine to the ground just as the bullet whizzed past. The sound of it missing her was deafening, a brief moment of relief before Dwayne heard the terrifyingly close sound of footsteps coming their way. Dwayne! Jasmine's voice was panicked as she scrambled beneath him. He could feel her heart racing against his chest. What's happening? Why are they shooting at us? Dwayne barely had time to process the question, his instincts taking over as he scrambled to his feet, pulling Jasmine up with him. We need to move now, he hissed, pushing her toward the door. The noise from the gunfire echoed through the warehouse, followed by angry shouts as more men began to move in. The chaos was growing, and it was only a matter of time before they were surrounded. They couldn't escape through the front. It was too obvious. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. "Where do we go?" Jasmine asked, her voice laced with fear, but she trusted him. She had to. "There's a back alley," Dwayne said, keeping his voice low, trying to assess the situation. "If we can make it there, we can get to the street without them spotting us. Follow my lead. Stay close." Jasmine nodded, her breathing shallow but determined. Dwayne's hand reached into his jacket, fingers brushing against the cold steel of his gun. He wasn't one for violence, but when it came to protecting those he cared about, there was no room for hesitation. He pulled the weapon from his side and held it ready, eyes scanning every corner of the warehouse. He had trained for moments like this, but even that didn't quell the anxiety gnawing at him. The door to the back alley was only a few dozen feet away, but it felt like miles. Dwayne's mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan. He had no backup. Robert's team was nowhere in sight, and the warehouse was quickly filling with men loyal to Collins. If they didn't act now, they were as good as dead. "Dwayne, they're right behind us." Jasmine's voice cracked, and he could hear the desperation creeping in. He turned to her. "I know, but I need you to trust me. When I say go, you run. No matter what." She looked up at him, her eyes wide but full of determination. It was clear she wasn't just afraid. She was ready to fight. But this wasn't a battle she could win with strength alone. They reached the alley door, and Dwayne pushed it open just enough to peek outside. The coast was clear for now, but he knew they didn't have long. On three. 1, 2. Before he could finish, a loud crash came from behind them. They were too late. The door at the far end of the warehouse was smashed open, and two men stormed in, guns raised. Dwayne reacted instantly, shoving Jasmine to the ground as he fired a quick shot, grazing one of the men's shoulders. He was buying them time, nothing more. The real danger was in the rush of footsteps behind them, closing in fast. "Go!" Dwayne yelled, pulling Jasmine to her feet. "Get to the alley. Now!" She didn't hesitate this time. She darted toward the door, her breath catching in her throat as she ran. But Dwayne stayed behind, using himself as a shield. The men fired at him, but Dwayne kept moving, a blur of action and instinct, dodging the shots while trying to cover Jasmine's escape. Another shot rang out, this one hitting him in the side. The impact was sharp, and Dwayne stumbled, but he forced himself forward, pain clouding his vision. Jasmine screamed his name, but he couldn't look back. Not yet. Not when they were so close to safety. He saw her disappear into the alleyway and then, as if driven by sheer force of will, he turned and followed her, moving faster than he thought possible. The blood seeping from his wound was a stark reminder that this wouldn't be easy. But it didn't matter. He couldn't let her down. They reached the alley just as the door to the warehouse burst open behind them. Dwayne slammed the door shut with everything he had, hearing the thud of boots on concrete echoing in the distance. He turned to Jasmine, gasping for breath, his heart still hammering in his chest. But Jasmine's expression wasn't one of relief. It was one of terror. Her eyes locked onto the blood seeping through his shirt, her face paling as she reached for him. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll be fine," Dwayne lied, gritting his teeth against the pain. He couldn't afford to let her see how bad it was. "We need to keep moving. They're coming." Jasmine shook her head, panic rising in her chest. "We can't just keep running, Dwayne. You're injured. We need help." "We don't have time," he said, pulling her along. "We can't stay here. Trust me. We'll get help once we're safe." The sound of footsteps in the distance grew louder, and Dwayne knew they didn't have much time. He could feel the blood soaking through his clothes, his strength slipping away with every step. But he kept moving. For Jasmine. For the promise he had made to her. They rounded the corner, and Dwayne saw the faint glow of headlights coming down the street. His heart leapt in his chest. "It's Roberts," he said, almost to himself. "We're almost there." As the car screeched to a halt in front of them, Roberts jumped out, his eyes immediately scanning the area for danger. "Dwayne!" he shouted, rushing over. "You're hit. Get in the car. Now." Jasmine helped Dwayne into the back seat, her hands shaking as she held him steady. He couldn't speak, couldn't move much as the car sped away, but his thoughts were racing. It wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Collins was still out there, and the web of corruption was far deeper than they had ever imagined. But for the first time in a long while, Dwayne allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had made it out. They were alive. And that was all that mattered for now. As the car sped into the night, Dwayne looked at Jasmine. She was safe. That was enough. For now. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?